Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you tuning in from? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Story 1. At 6:12 a.m., Marcus Thorne did what he'd done every morning for 12 years. He set the alarm, locked the front door, and walked toward his car. He didn't notice the silver sedan idling at the end of the block. He didn't notice the person in the driver's seat had been watching his bedroom window for 3 weeks. Marcus thought it was just another Tuesday. It was actually the last time anyone would see him alive. 7 days passed before the search began. Detective Sarah Chun stood in Marcus Thorne's kitchen at 8:47 a.m. on the following Tuesday, a week after his disappearance. The missing persons report had been filed by his employer at Castellan Financial Services. Marcus hadn't arrived for a client meeting on the morning of April 8th. His car was found in the parking garage of his apartment complex. Keys on the driver's seat, doors unlocked. No signs of forced entry. No body. No witnesses to the silver sedan. The apartment itself was unremarkable. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, beige carpet, Venetian blinds drawn. Chin pulled on latex gloves and began the methodical process. She opened the refrigerator first. The contents were cataloged. A carton of 2% milk, dated April 3rd, now 4 days past its printed expiration. 3 containers of Greek yogurt, all sealed, all dated April 1st. A package of deli turkey, opened on the 5th according to the handwritten date on the plastic. The freezer contained frozen dinners, 4 of them, in a stack. She noted the brand, the dates, the arrangement. Nothing appeared disturbed. The kitchen drawers revealed what kitchens always reveal, a junk accumulation of the mundane. She found a utility bill from March, opened but not filed. The amount was $112.47. She photographed it. Next to it, a credit card statement from March 15th, also opened. She read through the transactions methodically. A coffee shop on March 10th, $6.42. A grocery store on March 12th, $87.91. Gasoline on March 15th, $52.16. Nothing unusual. No large withdrawals, no exotic charges. She moved to the bedroom. The bed was made, sheets pulled taut, pillows positioned at the head. She checked the nightstand. A digital clock radio, unplugged, sitting at 12 o'clock. A reading lamp. A prescription bottle, sertraline, 50 milligrams, filled on February 2nd. The label read, "Take 1 tablet by mouth daily." She counted the remaining pills. 23 tablets remained in a bottle that should have held 30 tablets, given the fill date. That was a discrepancy of 7 tablets over 32 days. She noted this. In the dresser, she found socks in the left drawer, arranged by color. Underwear in the second. Shirts in the third. The arrangement was methodical, not obsessive, but deliberate. She examined the quality and wear of each item. The socks showed consistent age. The shirts, similar. Nothing suggested a hasty packing, nothing missing in obvious quantities. The closet held 7 pairs of shoes, all dark colors. 6 pairs appeared regularly worn. 1 pair, black leather dress shoes, size 10, showed no scuffs on the heel or toe. She lifted the left shoe. The sole bore a manufacturing code, Shanghai 2024 M47. The right shoe, identical in appearance, bore a different code, Shanghai 2024 L52. She photographed both soles from multiple angles, noting the serial discrepancy. The spare bedroom held a desk, a filing cabinet, and a rolling chair. She began with the desk drawers. The top drawer contained pens, all Pilot brand, blue ink, arranged in a line. Beneath them, a pad of lined paper, yellow, with approximately two-thirds of the pages used. She opened the pad. The handwriting was consistent across every page. Neat, uniform, the letters formed with mechanical precision. She photographed several pages. The content was sparse. Reminders: call mom, Sunday. Dry cleaning pickup. Check 401k statement. The second drawer held a checkbook. She opened it to the register. The most recent check written was number 2847, dated March 18th, payable to Consolidated Edison for $112. She cross-referenced this with the utility bill from the kitchen drawer. The amounts matched. The check before that, number 2846, was written on March 12th to Whole Foods Market for $97.52. Again, she found a matching receipt in a stack held together with a paper clip. The receipt was from the same date, same amount, same store. The filing cabinet contained 4 drawers. She opened the top one, tax documents, organized by year. She pulled 2025, the most recent. Inside were W-2 forms, 1,099 forms, statements from his brokerage account. The documents were in chronological order. She photographed each page. The second drawer held medical records. She found discharge papers from a hospital visit in 2019, a broken wrist, left side, from a fall while jogging, dental records from his dentist, an eye exam from January 2026, all ordinary, all filed. In the third drawer, she found something that altered the sequence of observations. A folder labeled Casa de Oro, a property name, or perhaps a business. Inside were documents related to a commercial lease. She read through the terms. A storefront in the financial district, 2,400 square feet, leased by Marcus Thorne in his personal name, beginning January 1st, 2026. The monthly rent was $6,500. She checked the lease agreement. It was signed on December 15th, 2025. She looked for corresponding credit card charges. There were none in the statements she'd reviewed. She found a separate folder beneath Casa de Oro. This one contained bank statements. Not personal bank statements. Statements for a business account, opened on December 20th, 2025 at Metropolitan Bank. The account holder was listed as Casa de Oro LLC, but the authorized user was Marcus Thorne. She reviewed the transaction history. The account had been opened with an initial deposit of $50,000, transferred from Marcus's personal savings account on the day it was created. Between December 20th and April 1st, there had been 12 deposits, each one exactly $15,000, made on the 5th and 20th of each month. Outflows were minimal. Wire transfers to the landlord for rent, one check to a contractor for $8,200 on January 10th, another to an electrical supply company for $3,400 on February 3rd. As of April 1st, the balance was $147,300. Chen photographed every page. The math was straightforward. $50,000 plus $180,000 in deposits minus rent and contractor payments equaled the remaining balance. The figures aligned. Nothing was hidden in the arithmetic. She returned to the top drawer of the filing cabinet and pulled out his 2025 tax return, filed electronically on April 10th, 6 days before his disappearance. His reported income from Castellan Financial Services was $187,000. There was no mention of Casa de Oro on Schedule C. No business income reported. No deductions claimed for the commercial space. She photographed the return, focusing on the signature line. His signature was present, dated April 10th, 2026. Across the bottom of the form, there was a notation, prepared by e-file tax services. She made note of the preparer's contact information. The fourth filing cabinet drawer contained personal documents, birth certificate, passport, insurance policies. She opened the passport. It showed 3 stamps: a trip to Canada in 2022, a trip to Mexico in 2019, and a trip to London in 2018. The passport wouldn't expire until 2033. Recent stamps, nothing within the last 2 years. Chen sat at the desk and reviewed her notes. The timeline was becoming clearer, though no clearer was the location of Marcus Thorne. December 15th, commercial lease signed. December 20th, business account opened. December 20th, initial deposit of $50,000. January 1st, lease begins. January 10th, contractor payment. February 3rd, electrical supply payment. February 2nd, sertraline prescription refilled. April 1st, final business account deposit. April 8th, Marcus Thorne disappears. She walked to the kitchen and opened the trash bin beneath the sink. Inside were coffee grounds in a filter, an empty milk carton, several pieces of junk mail, all dated within the past week. Nothing from Casa de Oro. Nothing relating to the business account. She examined the apartment's entry door. The lock was a standard deadbolt. No signs of tampering. She checked the windows, all locked from the inside. The bedroom window, the one the watcher had observed for 3 weeks, was also secure. Chen pulled out her phone and called the building superintendent. She asked him to check the security footage from the parking garage, specifically the footage from the morning of April 8th, beginning at 6 a.m. and ending at 9 a.m. She waited. 40 minutes later, the superintendent called back. The footage showed Marcus Thorne's car in the garage, parked in space 47. At 6:18 a.m., Marcus had arrived at the car, opened the door, and sat in the driver's seat. The video showed him sitting there, motionless, for approximately 12 minutes. At 6:30 a.m., he exited the vehicle, walked toward the elevator, and disappeared from the frame. Chun noted the discrepancy. The car was found with keys on the seat at approximately 7:15 a.m., when his employer's office manager called the building after Marcus failed to answer his phone. 55 minutes had elapsed between the moment he left the garage and the moment his car was discovered abandoned. She called the building's superintendent again. "I need the footage from the interior hallway," she said. Specifically the corridor leading from the elevator on the ground floor. 20 minutes later, she received confirmation. The interior cameras had been offline since April 3rd. A note in the maintenance log indicated that the building's security system had been scheduled for updates. The update had been pending since the 3rd, but the technician, contracted from an external security firm, had not yet completed the installation. Chen photographed the maintenance log, noting the date, the technician's name, not provided, only a reference number, TSF 4401, and the timestamp of the entry, 2:15 a.m. on April 3rd. She left the apartment and drove to Castellan Financial Services. The office occupied 3 floors of a building in the financial district, roughly 2 blocks from Casa de Oro. She met with the office manager, Patricia Simmons, a woman in her 50s who had been working there for 18 years. "When was the last time you saw Marcus?" Chen asked. "Thursday, April 6th, around 5 p.m. He left early that day. Said he had a personal matter to attend to. And the client meeting he missed on Tuesday, April 8th? That was unusual. Marcus never missed meetings. Never. He was punctual to a fault. The client was waiting for an hour before I called his apartment. Chen asked to review Marcus's work files and his most recent projects. She spent 3 hours in a conference room, reading through account statements, client correspondence, and transaction records. Marcus's work appeared meticulous, spreadsheets balanced, client communications detailed and professional, deadlines met. No obvious conflicts emerged. No indication of fraud or embezzlement on his part. She asked Patricia Simmons about Casa de Oro. The office manager's face remained blank. "I don't know what that is," she said. Chen drove to the storefront in the financial district. The address corresponded to a ground-floor commercial space between a laundromat and a vacant real estate office. The storefront's windows were covered with brown paper from the inside. Through a gap in the paper, Chen could see shelving units, unpainted drywall, and what appeared to be construction materials. She tried the door. It was locked. She looked for a business sign. There was none. She photographed the storefront, the door, the lock mechanism, and the address number on the wall. She returned to the precinct and filed a warrant request for access to the Casa de Oro premises. While waiting for the warrant, she called e-file tax services and spoke with a tax preparer named Robert Valdez. She asked about Marcus Thorne's 2025 return. "Yes, I prepared that," Valdez said. "He provided all the documents. I filed it as he requested." "Did he mention Casa de Oro?" There was a pause. "No, he didn't. The return showed his income from his primary employment only." "Did you ask him about other income sources?" "Of course. It's standard procedure." He said he had none. Chen asked for copies of the documents Marcus had provided to Valdez. 20 minutes later, they arrived via email. She reviewed them. The W-2 from Castellan, bank statements showing only his personal checking and savings accounts, and a handwritten note with itemized deductions. The handwriting matched what she'd seen in his apartment, the neat, uniform script. Nothing mentioned Casa de Oro. She called the landlord of Casa de Oro, a commercial property management company called Meridian Real Estate Holdings. The woman who answered identified herself as the property manager, Linda Torres. "The tenant, Marcus Thorne. Do you have contact information for him beyond his personal phone number?" "I have his email. That's how we communicate regarding lease matters and rent payments." "Has he been responsive?" "Yes, very responsive. Professional. He pays on time. I'd like to see the interior of the space. For a police investigation." Torres's tone changed. "I'll need authorization from corporate. I'm obtaining a warrant," Chen said. At 2:30 p.m., the warrant was approved. Chen arrived at the Casa de Oro storefront with another detective and a locksmith. The lock was a commercial-grade deadbolt, requiring a key. The locksmith bypassed it in 90 seconds. The interior was a shell, an empty commercial space, roughly 25 feet wide and 30 feet deep. The walls were bare drywall, unpainted. The floor was concrete, unsealed. Along the far wall sat 3 metal shelving units, empty except for one box. Chen approached it and opened the flaps. Inside were business cards. She picked one up and read it. Casa de Oro Investments. Marcus Thorne, Managing Director. Direct, 555-0847 Beneath the business cards were marketing materials, professionally printed brochures describing an investment opportunity. Chen read through one carefully. The brochure outlined an investment fund, described as a curated collection of emerging market opportunities with projected returns of 12 to 18% annually. The minimum investment was $50,000. The fund was managed, according to the brochure, by Marcus Thorne and Casa de Oro Investment Partners. No other partners were named. No corporate registration was listed. No SEC registration number was provided. Chen photographed every page of the brochure, every business card. She checked the dates on the printing. March 15th, 2026. The printer's name appeared on the back. Apex Printing Solutions, 242, Commerce Street. She bagged the entire box and photographed the empty shelving units, the bare walls, the concrete floor. At Apex Printing Solutions, she spoke with the owner, a man named David Chun, no relation. He pulled up the job in his system. This was a rush order, he explained. Placed on March 10th, completed March 15th. He wanted 500 copies, full color. Paid in cash, $1, 200. Do you have any email correspondence with him? Yes, some. He sent me the PDF file on March 9th. Wanted minimal changes. Very specific about the color and the font. Chen requested the email chain. David Chen forwarded it to her police email within minutes. The correspondence showed Marcus sending the file at 11:47 p.m. on March 9th, with the message, "Please print these exactly as shown. 500 copies. Full color. Rush job. I'll pick them up March 15th and pay in cash." The date and timestamp meant Marcus had composed and sent that email from the apartment. The timestamp placed it during the late evening hours, a time when he was typically home, based on the patterns evident in his utility usage and credit card transactions. But the tone of the email, the specificity of the request, and the arrangement to pay in cash rather than via credit card marked a departure from the methodical documentation evident in other areas of his life. Chen returned to the police station and compiled her findings into a preliminary report. The evidence accumulated as facts. 1. Marcus Thorne had established a business entity with $180,000 in deposits over 4 months, while reporting zero business income to the IRS. 2. He had leased a commercial storefront on December 15th, which served no apparent legitimate purpose and contained only marketing materials for an unregistered investment fund. 3. He had commissioned 500 copies of investment brochures on March 9th to 15th, paying in cash, requesting secrecy through the timing of his emails and payment method. 4. He had failed to disclose Casa de Oro or its income on his 2025 tax return filed on April 10th. 5. The security system footage in his apartment building had been offline since April 3rd, 5 days before his disappearance, under the guise of a scheduled maintenance update that had not been completed. 6. He had sat in his car in the parking garage for 12 minutes on the morning of April 8th before exiting and walking toward the elevator. 7. He had disappeared between 6:30 a.m. and 7:15 a.m., a 55-minute window. 8. 2 shoes in his closet bore different manufacturing serial numbers despite appearing identical. The narrative was incomplete. The evidence suggested fraud, a Ponzi scheme or investment scam targeting individuals with disposable capital. The $180,000 in deposits represented capital being moved through the business account, likely the collected funds from early investors who had responded to the Casa de Oro brochures. But the final piece remained absent, the location of Marcus Thorne. Chun filed the preliminary report and requested authorization to subpoena the Casa de Oro business account records from Metropolitan Bank, including the names and account numbers of all wire transfer recipients. She also requested surveillance footage from the building housing Casa de Oro, the coffee shop where Marcus had charged $6.42, the parking garage of his apartment complex beyond the initial morning footage, and the street-level cameras within a 3-block radius of his apartment building. She requested a canine search of the parking garage, the hallways, and the storage areas of his apartment building. and she waited for the search results to accumulate their own evidence. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Marcus Thorne's disappearance, in the form of a Federal Express delivery receipt. Detective Chun was reviewing the building superintendent's maintenance log for the third time when she noticed an entry dated April 2nd at 11:15 p.m. A technician from TSF Security Solutions had accessed the security system for routine diagnostics. The entry was signed by someone with the initials EV. The signature was a cursive loop, hurried but legible. She had already confirmed that TSF Security Solutions did not exist. The reference number she'd found earlier, TSF 4401, had yielded no results in any database. The company name was a fabrication, the technician a ghost, but the signature remained. Chun pulled the FedEx delivery records from the building's front desk for the week of April 1st through April 8th. 3 packages had been delivered to the building. One to a resident on the 4th floor on April 3rd, one to the building's management office on April 5th, and one signed for on April 2nd at 8:47 a.m. by someone named E. Valdez. The building's management office records showed that the April 2nd delivery had been signed for by an outside party, not a resident, not staff. The recipient line read, Casa de Oro Installation Services. The package had been delivered to a temporary address in the building's lobby, then forwarded to the Casa de Oro storefront. E. Valdez. Chun pulled up the contact information for Robert Valdez, the tax preparer. She cross-referenced his middle initial and full name in the state business database. Robert Edwin Valdez. Age 47. He had lived at the same address for 12 years, an apartment in the Sunset District, approximately 4 miles from Marcus Thorne's building. She called the FedEx distribution center and requested the sender information for the package delivered on April 2nd. The sender's address was listed as a mailbox service in Oakland. The package contents were declared as security equipment. Chun pulled Robert Valdez's business registration. E-File Tax Services had been established in 2018, operating from a home office in the Sunset District. The business had 12 clients, according to the filed tax returns she'd reviewed. 12 clients generating perhaps $15,000 to $25,000 in annual revenue, not a substantial income. But Robert Valdez had another business registration, filed in 2025 under a different name, Security Diagnostics Consulting. The address was the same Oakland mailbox service. She called the IRS and requested Robert Valdez's business income for 2024 and 2025. The agent put her on hold for 6 minutes. Mr. Valdez reported $18,500 in business income for 2024 under E-File Tax Services, the agent said. For 2025, he reported $19,200 from the same business. But he hasn't filed his return for 2025 yet. The deadline is April 15th. Chun checked the calendar. Today was April 30th. Valdez was 9 days late. She drove to his apartment building, a 3-story structure from the 1970s, pale yellow with dark trim. Unit 12 was on the ground floor. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She called the building manager, who arrived 15 minutes later with a passkey. Inside, the apartment was empty, not just vacant, but cleared. The furniture was gone. The walls were bare. The kitchen held no appliances, no dishes, no food. The only objects remaining were dust outlines on the carpet where furniture had rested. Chun photographed everything. She checked the lease agreement with the building manager. Robert Valdez's lease had ended on March 31st. He had given 30 days notice on March 1st, paid his final month's rent on time, and received his security deposit back in full on April 2nd. April 2nd, the same day the FedEx package was sent to Casa de Oro. The same day someone using his initials had signed into Marcus Thorne's building to disable the security system. She called the bank that held Robert Valdez's business checking account for security diagnostics consulting. The agent confirmed that the account had been closed on April 3rd. The final balance of $1,847.33 had been transferred to a savings account at the same bank. "Do you have an address for the savings account?" Chen asked. "Yes, a residential address." But the customer provided updated contact information on March 29th. New mailing address out of state. "Where?" "Las Vegas, Nevada." A postal box. Chen sat in her car outside the empty apartment and reviewed her notes. The timeline restructured itself. March 1st, Valdez gave notice to terminate his lease. March 9th, Marcus Thorne sent PDF files to Apex Printing for Casa de Oro brochures, payment to be made in cash. March 15th, Casa de Oro brochures printed and delivered to Valdez, signed E. Valdez. March 29th, Valdez updated his bank contact information to Las Vegas address. March 31st, Valdez's lease ended. April 2nd, Valdez received his security deposit refund. Someone with initials EV accessed Marcus Thorne's building security system and disabled the interior hallway cameras. April 3rd, Valdez closed his security diagnostics consulting account. April 8th, Marcus Thorne disappeared. The narrative became clear in its brutal simplicity. Robert Valdez had prepared Marcus Thorne's tax return on April 10th, 2025, 6 days before the disappearance. Valdez had seen the documents Marcus provided: proof of substantial savings, proof of regular income, proof of liquid assets. Valdez had also, at some point, learned about Casa de Oro. Perhaps Marcus had mentioned it during a consultation. Perhaps Valdez had seen documents left in the office, noticed the business account details, recognized the investment opportunity. Or perhaps Marcus had confided in him. Valdez was his tax preparer, a professional he trusted. Valdez had calculated the mathematics. Marcus Thorne had $180,000 moving through the Casa de Oro account. He was collecting funds from investors. The investment fund was unregistered. The tax return showed no business income. The operation was a fraud, a Ponzi scheme designed to generate returns from imaginary investments. Valdez understood the vulnerability. Marcus was committing a federal crime. He would solicit funds under false pretenses. He would eventually be discovered, prosecuted, imprisoned. His assets would be seized. His bank accounts would be frozen. But what if Valdez could accelerate that timeline? What if Valdez could become the architect of Marcus's disappearance? The security system needed to be disabled. Valdez had arranged that through the fake FedEx delivery and the fictitious TSF Security Solutions Company. The interior hallway cameras would be offline, leaving no visual record of Marcus's movements after 6:30 a.m. The Casa de Oro investment fund needed to continue functioning. Valdez could facilitate that. He understood tax preparation, financial documentation, the bureaucratic language of official forms. He could forge signatures. He could create false bank statements. He could impersonate Marcus Thorne through email correspondence with the landlord, the bank, the printers. Marcus Thorne had become a liability, and Robert Valdez had become the solution to his own problem. Chen pulled the files from the Casa de Oro business account. She called Metropolitan Bank and requested the wire transfer records for all deposits made after April 8th. On April 10th, A wire transfer of $25,000 had been initiated from the Casa de Oro account to an investment account at a bank in Las Vegas. The authorization email had come from Marcus Thorne's work email address. The signature on the authorization form was Marcus's signature, but it was a photocopy, not an original. On April 12th, another wire transfer of $30,000 had been sent to the same Las Vegas account. Again, the authorization came from Marcus's email. Again, the signature was a copy. Chun called Las Vegas PD and provided them with the account information. 20 minutes later, they confirmed that the account had been opened on April 8th in the name of Robert Valdez, with a mailing address to the postal box he'd referenced. She obtained a warrant for Robert Valdez's email accounts. The service provider complied within hours. She reviewed the sent folder of Robert Valdez's personal email account. On April 8th at 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes after Marcus had exited his car in the parking garage, Robert Valdez had sent an email to the Casa de Oro landlord from Marcus's work email account. The message read, "I need to liquidate the fund immediately. Please initiate a wire transfer of all remaining assets to the account information provided below." The account information was for the Las Vegas Bank. On April 9th, the landlord, Linda Torres, had responded with concern. "This is unusual, Marcus. I thought the fund was ongoing. What's changed?" Robert Valdez, impersonating Marcus, had responded, "Personal circumstances require the liquidation. I'll be out of the country for several months. Please execute the transfer by end of business today." The landlord had complied. The remaining Casa de Oro account balance, approximately $115,000, had been transferred to the Las Vegas account on April 9th at 2:15 p.m. Robert Valdez had stolen $180,000 in investor funds by eliminating the person who controlled the account, impersonating him through email and forged documentation, and liquidating the assets before disappearance would trigger questions. The question of Marcus Thorne's physical location remained unanswered. The question of whether he was alive or deceased remained open, but the identity of the person responsible for his disappearance was no longer in doubt. Chun filed an arrest warrant for Robert Edwin Valdez on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and securities fraud. She filed a separate warrant for a search of the Casa de Oro storefront, the vacant apartment, and any storage units registered to Valdez's name. She contacted the FBI field office and provided them with the documentation. The federal crime crossed jurisdictional lines. The fraud involved wire transfers across state borders. This investigation would now escalate beyond municipal police work. At 2:40 p.m., she called the Las Vegas Police Department and requested they conduct surveillance on the postal box Valdez had rented. At 3:15 p.m., surveillance confirmed that a man matching Valdez's description had visited the box, retrieved mail, and driven north toward California in a vehicle registered to a rental company. At 4:30 p.m., the Highway Patrol located the vehicle near Barstow, California. They initiated a traffic stop. Robert Valdez was inside, alone, with a suitcase containing $87,400 in cash, the portion of the stolen funds he'd managed to withdraw before the wire transfers were frozen. In the suitcase, investigators also found Marcus Thorne's passport, Marcus Thorne's wallet, and Marcus Thorne's watch. Chun reviewed the final pieces of the puzzle from the police station. The objects confirmed the narrative without explaining it. The passport and wallet suggested Marcus had handed them to Valdez voluntarily or had them taken at the moment of his disappearance. The cash suggested Valdez's intention to disappear, to abandon his identity, to become someone new in a place where the past could not follow. The watch suggested something else. A memento, a trophy, a confirmation of the act itself. Valdez, under interrogation in Las Vegas, eventually provided the location. Marcus Thorne's body was discovered on April 10th in a storage unit outside Stockton, California. The day after the security system had been disabled, the day after the business account had been drained, the day after Robert Valdez had finalized his plan. Marcus had been dead for 36 hours before anyone knew he was missing. The autopsy would later reveal a blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, consistent with a hammer strike. The coroner noted that death had likely occurred within minutes. There were no signs of prolonged suffering, no evidence of torture or deliberate cruelty. It had been methodical, efficient, clinical, consistent with a person who understood the necessity of the act without requiring it to inflict additional pain. Robert Valdez had calculated the cost of his own financial desperation, projected it forward through time, and decided that Marcus Thorne's life was worth less than the burden of his own insufficient income, his own failed investments, his own accumulating debt. The math had been simple. The execution had been simpler. Chen filed her final report on May 2nd. The document was 47 pages, structured chronologically, supported by bank statements, email records, surveillance footage, and forensic analysis. Every conclusion was tethered to physical evidence. Every inference was grounded in documented fact. The case would proceed to trial. The evidence was abundant and irrefutable. The narrative was complete. What remained was the familiar weight of knowing that the methodical accumulation of mundane details, a signature on a delivery receipt, a timeline that overlapped, a pattern of financial transactions, had been sufficient to construct an entire edifice of truth. The truth was not dramatic. It was not surprising. It was simply the quiet consequence of human desperation meeting human opportunity, filtered through the bureaucratic machinery of modern life, recorded in receipts and timestamps, and the permanent digital footprints that everyone leaves behind. Marcus Thorne had been forgotten almost before he was missed. Robert Valdez had planned his disappearance with the same meticulous care he applied to tax returns, checking each box, verifying each figure, ensuring that the mathematics aligned. In the end, the mathematics had aligned perfectly, just not in the way Valdez had intended. Story 2. A local bookstore owner discovered her business was failing despite record sales after her lead clerk spent 2 years processing cash returns for books that were never actually sold. The bookstore owner, Margaret, sat in the back office on a Tuesday morning in late September, 3 weeks after the discovery that had prompted her to call in an auditor. The fluorescent panels overhead cast their neutral glow across the desk. A banker's box of receipts sat in front of her, each slip of paper arranged in chronological order by the auditor's assistant. The box smelled of aging paper and dust. She had decided to conduct her own search while waiting for the formal audit report. The math was simple enough to verify herself. Between January 2022 and August 2024, her lead clerk, David Rothstein, had processed cash returns for approximately $47,000 in merchandise. The problem: the inventory records showed no corresponding books had ever entered the return stream. The books had never been sold. The cash had simply vanished from the register. Margaret began with the return slips themselves. She pulled one at random from the box dated March 14, 2023. The handwriting was consistent, a neat, compact cursive in blue ballpoint. The return reason listed was customer dissatisfaction. The book title was The Architecture of Memory, ISBN 5-0-8112-1847-2. The refund issued line showed $18.47 in cash. She opened the point-of-sale system on the desk computer and searched for that ISBN. The system's digital log showed no corresponding sale record. She ran the search 3 separate times, using different parameters. The result remained consistent. No entry existed. Margaret pulled 5 more slips at random. March 18th, April 2nd, April 9th, June 7th, July 22nd. She checked each ISBN. None appeared in the sales logs. The pattern was absolute. She then examined the physical slips more carefully. Each return form was pre-printed with the bookstore's logo and invoice number. The numbers ran sequentially: 4782, 4783, 4784. But when she extracted every 10th slip from the box and arranged them by invoice number, she found gaps. Invoice 4812 appeared, then 4814, then 4817. 15 invoices were missing from the sequence. Margaret opened a filing cabinet beneath the desk. The return forms were supposed to be kept in carbon copy duplicates, with the original in the registered drawer at the time of transaction and the copy filed alphabetically by customer name. She pulled the hanging files. The dividers were labeled A through Z. Under the M section, where returns from March should have been cross-referenced, she found only 12 forms. Under June, she found 6. The discrepancy between the box of loose receipts and the filed copies suggested 2 separate record-keeping systems. She counted the loose slips in the banker's box, 247 return forms. She then counted the carbon copies in the filing cabinet, 89 forms. The difference was 158. She moved to the register itself, an older model that Rothstein had used exclusively during the evening shifts. The machine still occupied the counter in the front of the store, unplugged since the auditor's team had begun their preliminary review. She carried it back to the office and set it on the desk. The cash register had a built-in receipt tape that ran on a mechanical spool inside the machine's housing. She opened the metal casing on the back. The tape was a continuous paper ribbon, narrow and thin. The most recent entries showed dates from August 22nd through August 29th, 2024, the period just before the discovery. She began scrolling backward through the tape manually, reading the mechanical print. Each line showed a transaction type, amount, and timestamp. The timestamps were printed by an internal clock mechanism. She noticed that certain hours of the night showed unusual density. Between 9:02 p.m. and 9:47 p.m. on July 8th, the tape recorded 17 separate cash transactions, returns, all of them. No other transactions appeared during that window. On July 15th, 16 returns appeared between 8:19 p.m. and 9:01 p.m. Margaret photographed each page of the tape with her phone, zooming in on the timestamp mechanism. The font was consistent, but the ink density on some entries was slightly lighter than others. She pulled the tape further and found sections where the mechanical printer appeared to have skipped lines. The spacing between transactions was irregular, suggesting the tape had been advanced manually rather than by automatic feed. She set the tape aside and examined the register's physical key mechanisms. The keys for numerical entries showed more where on the keys for 4, 1, 8, and 7. The digits most commonly used in the return slip sequence she had identified. The other keys appeared virtually untouched. The register's cash drawer was divided into compartments for bills and coins. She removed the drawer and examined its interior. On the underside of the drawer, someone had written figures in faded pencil. $18.47, $23.15, $16.89, $41.22. For entries in the same handwriting that appeared on the loose return slips. The pencil marks had been partially erased, leaving faint traces that were only visible when she tilted the drawer toward the fluorescent light. Margaret opened the safe in the corner of the office. It was a standard model, painted gray, with a rotating dial combination lock. The lock showed signs of recent use. The dial face was brighter where fingers had repeatedly gripped it, and there was a thin layer of dust everywhere else on the safe's exterior, except for the dial and handle. She pulled the manufacturer's information from the safe's documentation file. It showed the model had been installed in 1998. She then retrieved the cash reconciliation sheets Rothstein had filed monthly. These were printed forms where the clerk would record the opening cash balance, total cash receipts, cash returns, and closing balance. She laid out 12 months of sheets across the desk, January through December 2023. The handwriting on these forms matched the return slips, Rothstein's neat cursive, but the ink color varied. Some months were written in blue ballpoint, some in black. 1 month, April, was written in green gel pen. She examined the actual pen strokes under a magnifying glass. The pressure applied to the pen varied inconsistently from line to line on the April sheet. On the other months, the pressure was uniform, suggesting the sheets had been filled out in single sessions. The April sheet showed a closing cash balance of $8,247.18. Margaret pulled the bank deposit slip for April. The amount deposited was $8,031.92. The discrepancy was $215.26. She opened the digital accounting software and pulled up the same period. The system showed April closing cash as $8,209.64. This figure didn't match either the handwritten reconciliation, $8,247.18, or the bank deposit, $8,031.92. All three documents showed different numbers for the same day. Margaret photographed each version and made a notation in a separate document. She wrote, "Handwritten reconciliation, April 30th, 2023 $8, 247.18. Digital system entry, April 30th, 2023 $8, 209.64. Bank deposit, May 1st, 2023 $8, 031.92. She then compared the handwriting on the digital system entries to the handwritten reconciliation forms. The digital system required login credentials. She checked the system logs. All entries for the month of April had been made under Rothstein's username, with timestamps clustered between 10:34 p.m. and 11:02 p.m. on April 30th. Margaret returned to the filing cabinet and pulled every monthly reconciliation form from 2022 through August 2024. She laid them out chronologically on the floor. 20 months of forms, all in Rothstein's handwriting, all showing closing balances that were recorded in the system with slight variations. She selected 5 months at random and compared each month's handwritten closing balance to its corresponding digital entry. The variation ranged from $47 to $287. In each case, the handwritten amount was higher than the digital system amount. The difference, in each month, corresponded precisely to the cash that had left the register but never appeared in the bank deposit. Margaret photographed the entire layout of forms on the floor, taking several shots from different angles to ensure the dates and amounts were legible. She then turned her attention to the return slip forms themselves. The pre-printed slips came from a printing company 5 blocks away. She called and asked to speak with the manager. Within an hour, she had arranged a meeting. At the printer's office, she handed over 3 sample return slips from 3 different months. The manager examined them under a light. He then consulted his records on a computer terminal. These slips were printed in December 2021, he said. Batch of 5,000 units. Invoice number starts at 4750. The numbering sequence runs to 5750. Margaret asked to see the original design file. The manager printed it out. The pre-printed logo and formatting matched the slips she had brought, but the invoice numbers on the design file started at 4750 and ended at 4799 for the first batch. You said 5,000 units, Margaret said. That's 1,000 invoices starting at 4750, ending at 5750. But your design file shows only 50 invoices per batch. The manager checked his records again. We printed multiple batches, he confirmed. The customer, Rothstein, placed the order directly. Paid in cash. Margaret stood very still. Rothstein placed the order, not the bookstore owner. Yes, he came in person. December 12th, 2021. Paid $340 in cash. She asked for documentation. The manager pulled a receipt. The handwriting was Rothstein's. The payment notation read, cash, full payment for first batch, customer to request reorders as needed. Margaret photographed the receipt with her phone. She returned to the bookstore with the information. The discovery created a clear timeline. Rothstein had ordered blank return slip forms, but he had ordered them printed with sequential invoice numbers that fell within the range of the bookstore's actual return slips. This would allow the false returns to appear legitimate at first glance. Margaret then examined the physical condition of the return slips more carefully. She selected a random slip from her collection and measured its dimensions. 3.5 inches by 5.5 inches, standard receipt size. She measured the thickness of the paper by inserting 5 slips into a caliper. The total thickness was 0.019 inches, or approximately 0.48 millimeters per slip. She then pulled a slip from the filing cabinet, a legitimate return that had been processed correctly with a corresponding sale in the system. She measured this slip's thickness separately, 0.51 millimeters. The difference was minimal, but it was measurable. The fraudulent slips were slightly thinner. Margaret checked the printer's specifications for the 2021 order. The paper stock was listed as 24 pounds bond. She pulled other slips from the bookstore's inventory and found that all officially ordered slips from the manufacturer used 28 pounds bond. The fraudulent batch had been printed on cheaper, thinner stock. This explained why Rothstein had ordered directly from the printer and paid in cash, avoiding the bookstore's official account. A separate vendor, or a lower-grade run of the same vendor, had provided the blanks. Margaret set up a comparison layout on the office desk. She placed 3 slips side by side, one from the fraudulent batch, one from the legitimate bookstore stock, and one from the 2021 printer batch that she had obtained from the manager. Under the fluorescent light, the fraudulent slip appeared slightly more translucent. The paper's surface texture was smoother, lacking the subtle grain visible on the legitimate bookstore forms. She then examined the ink used on each set of slips. The pre-printed logo and text on the legitimate forms showed a specific shade of blue. The fraudulent form's ink appeared slightly darker. She pulled a magnifying glass and inspected the pre-printed invoice numbers. On the legitimate forms, the numbers were crisp and uniform. On the fraudulent forms, The edges of the numerals showed microscopic irregularities, the marks of a slightly worn printing plate. Margaret documented all of this in a separate folder, organizing her photographs chronologically and by evidence type. The physical evidence told a consistent story. Rothstein had obtained fraudulent return slips, had used them to generate false cash returns that existed only in the register's mechanical record, and had then altered the digital accounting records to mask the discrepancies. The total amount, by her current count, was approximately $18,247 across 28 months of fraudulent returns. She sat alone in the office, surrounded by the accumulated evidence, as the afternoon light shifted through the small window. The fluorescent panels hummed their constant frequency. Outside, the bookstore remained open for business, customers moving through the shelves unaware that the owner had just spent 8 hours reducing months of systematic theft to a sequence of measurable, documented facts. Margaret sat in the office chair at 2:17 a.m. on a Wednesday, 3 days after discovering the discrepancy in the monthly reconciliation sheets. She had closed the bookstore hours earlier. The fluorescent panels overhead had been switched off. Instead, she worked under the focused beam of a desk lamp, which cast a sharp circle of illumination across the computer monitor and left the surrounding office in shadow. She had decided to examine Rothstein's digital access logs in detail. The bookstore's accounting software maintained a record of every login, logout, and data modification. She pulled the raw log files from the system's backup drive, a document containing 47,000 individual entries spanning from January 1st, 2022 to August 29th, 2024. The log displayed information in columns: username, timestamp, action type, record modified, and the specific value entered or changed. She began scrolling through the entries chronologically, watching the mechanical progression of dates and times. Most entries were routine: inventory adjustments, sales entries, cash deposits. But certain patterns emerged as she scanned the data. Rothstein's username appeared in the logs with expected frequency during business hours. But there was a secondary cluster of entries at night, between 10 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., that occurred with irregular intervals. Some nights showed no entries. Other nights showed 30 or 40 modifications in a 15-minute window. She created a separate spreadsheet and began logging these nighttime sessions. She extracted every entry made by Rothstein between 10 p.m. and midnight across all 28 months in the data. The spreadsheet grew: 847 individual entries. She then filtered the data to show only modifications to the monthly closing balance field, the specific number that had been altered to mask the missing cash. Across 28 months, that field had been modified 156 times. This meant some months had been adjusted multiple times, suggesting Rothstein had made corrections or refinements after initial entries. Margaret opened the sales data for the same period and ran a comparison. During business hours, the bookstore's sales volume was consistent, an average of $487 per day, with minor fluctuations based on day of the week. But the night entries, the ones Rothstein had made after 10 p.m., showed a different pattern. She created a chart comparing daytime sales to the total cash adjustments Rothstein had recorded during night sessions. The correlation was inverse. On days when sales were particularly strong, the night session adjustments were minimal. On slower sales days, Rothstein's after-hours modifications showed larger discrepancies between the initial closing balance and the final recorded balance. This suggested a deliberate strategy. Rothstein had monitored the day's actual sales and then adjusted the closing balance downward to account for the cash he had removed. The smaller the day's legitimate revenue, the smaller the adjustment needed to avoid obvious discrepancy. Margaret then examined the timestamps on these night sessions with greater precision. The software recorded time in military format with seconds included. She sorted all 847 nighttime entries by exact timestamp and examined the intervals between them. Most entries were separated by intervals of 5 to 30 seconds. This was consistent with a person manually entering data, typing a value, pressing enter, waiting a moment, then proceeding to the next record. But within the cluster of 156 entries that modified the closing balance field, she found a subsection where the intervals were far shorter, 2 to 4 seconds apart. The entries occurred on specific dates. April 30th, 2023, 8 entries in a 19-second window. June 28th, 2023, 11 entries in a 34-second window. August 31st, 2023, 6 entries in a 16-second window. January 31st, 2024, 9 entries in a 22-second window. These intervals were too brief for manual data entry. A person could not physically type a value, press enter, and move to the next record in 2 seconds. Margaret considered the possibility that Rothstein had used some form of automated script or macro, a programmed sequence of commands that could execute multiple entries in rapid succession. She checked the software's technical documentation. The accounting system was designed with a standard database backend and did not support user-created macros or scripting. However, the interface was accessible through the system's API, an advanced feature that allowed external programs to read and write data directly. Margaret contacted the software vendor's technical support line. The representative informed her that API access required a separate authentication token, which was issued only to administrators or authorized integrators. She checked the bookstore's account profile. No API token had been issued. She then examined the system's event log, a separate technical file that recorded all authentication attempts, both successful and failed. This file contained different information than the user-facing transaction log. It showed the specific method used to access the system: direct login, API call, or remote connection. She opened the event log in a text editor. The file was large, nearly 900 kilobytes, and contained technical jargon, but the structure was consistent. Each line represented an access attempt and included a timestamp, username, authentication method, and result code. Margaret wrote a script using basic text processing commands to extract only the entries for Rothstein's account. The filtered results showed 4,237 access attempts across 28 months. Of these, 4,089 were recorded as direct login, which meant Rothstein had typed a username and password into the software's interface. But 148 entries were recorded as API call, indicating access through the system's programming interface. Margaret cross-referenced the dates and times of the API calls with the nighttime modification entries. The overlap was absolute. Every instance where closing balance entries had been made in rapid succession of 2 to 4 seconds occurred during timestamps labeled as API calls. Furthermore, the API calls were initiated from an IP address that was different from the bookstore's internal network. The IP address was registered to an internet service provider serving a residential area 2 miles from the bookstore. Margaret pulled public records on the address. It was associated with an apartment complex on Riverside Drive. She then reviewed Rothstein's employment file. His application listed his home address as 447 Riverside Drive, apartment 3C. The IP address from the API calls traced back to the Riverside Drive address block. This indicated that Rothstein had accessed the accounting system remotely from his home computer. He had authenticated through an API connection that should not have been available to his account. Someone had either granted him unauthorized access or he had obtained authentication credentials through other means. Margaret returned to the physical evidence. She pulled the bookstore's original software installation documentation and hardware receipts. The system had been installed in 2018 by an external IT consultant. She retrieved the consultant's contact information from the records file and called his office the following morning. The consultant, a man named Gregory Paulson, agreed to meet with her. At his office, located in a commercial building downtown, she asked about the system's security setup and who had access to administrative functions. Paulson pulled up his records on a computer. The bookstore owner had the primary admin account, he said. I set that up. I also created a secondary admin account for whoever managed day-to-day operations. That was supposed to be just for technical maintenance and staff management. Who was assigned to the secondary admin account? Margaret asked. Paulson checked his files. David Rothstein. The owner requested I set it up for him back in 2019. He was managing the store at that time. And an admin account would have access to generate API tokens? Yes, Paulson said. Full API access is a standard admin feature. I don't restrict that. Margaret asked to review the installation documentation. Paulson provided it. The setup guide detailed the API authentication system. It stated that API tokens were issued by administrators and could be revoked at any time. The document also included a password recovery procedure. If an admin account password was forgotten, it could be reset using a secondary email address registered to that account. Margaret asked if Rothstein's secondary email address was still active in the system. Paulson logged into the bookstore's account and checked the admin profile. The secondary email was listed as d.rothstein.admin@protonmail.com, a free email service that offered privacy-focused communication. Margaret asked Paulson to attempt a password reset on the secondary admin account to verify the email address was still accessible. Paulson performed a reset, and the system sent a confirmation message to the Proton Mail address. The reset was successful, indicating the email account remained active and monitored. This confirmed that Rothstein maintained access to an administrative account even after the fraudulent scheme had been discovered and he had been separated from his position at the bookstore. He could potentially regain access to the accounting system at any time using the secondary email address. Margaret returned to the bookstore and met with its owner. She presented the evidence, the API calls from Rothstein's residential IP address, the rapid succession modifications to the closing balance field that could only be accomplished through automated scripts, the secondary admin account with a monitored email address, and the timeline showing these after-hours accesses correlated precisely with the days of missing cash. The owner's face remained neutral as she absorbed the information. She asked one question: can he still access the system? Potentially, Margaret said. He has a secondary email address linked to an admin account. If he hasn't been blocked, he could reset the password and regain access. The owner stood up and left the office. She returned 5 minutes later with a laptop. She pulled up the bookstore's account settings and changed the password on the primary admin account. She then located the secondary admin account in the system configuration and deleted it entirely. Margaret observed the process, noting the specific menu selections and confirmation dialog that appeared. The deletion was permanent. Any future access attempts using that account would return an error message. She then asked the owner for permission to conduct a physical search of the office and back rooms. The owner agreed. Margaret began in the storage area behind the sales counter. A series of metal shelving units held boxes of inventory, office supplies, and archived records. She examined each shelf systematically, moving from left to right, top to bottom. On the third shelf, behind a box of printer paper, she found a laptop computer. The device was a Dell model, approximately 4 years old based on the serial number and specifications. The casing showed signs of regular use, minor scuff marks, and dust accumulation. The power cable was coiled beside it. Margaret photographed the laptop from multiple angles, documenting its position in relation to the surrounding boxes. She then carefully removed it and brought it to the office. She did not attempt to power on the device. Instead, she examined its exterior specifications. The serial number was printed on a label on the underside for GJ7K29. She documented this number and cross-referenced it with Dell's public database. The computer had been purchased in March 2021, approximately 8 months before Rothstein ordered the fraudulent return slips. She then examined the laptop's physical condition more carefully. The keyboard showed uneven wear patterns. The letters L, E, T, A, S, and E on the keyboard had a slightly worn appearance compared to other keys. She photographed the keyboard surface under the desk lamp, ensuring the wear patterns were visible. The pattern of wear suggested frequent typing of specific letters, possibly indicating commonly used words or commands. The sequence LETSE could form partial words or programming commands, but the wear pattern was too subtle to draw definitive conclusions without more evidence. She then examined the laptop's USB ports and external connectors. Most showed signs of regular use, minor corrosion, or wear around the edges. But one USB port on the left side of the device was notably clean and showed minimal signs of use. Conversely, the USB port on the right side showed deep scratches around its perimeter, as if a USB cable or device had been repeatedly inserted and removed. Margaret located the laptop's power adapter and examined the cord. The cable showed a pronounced kink approximately 2 feet from the power brick, suggesting the adapter had been stored or transported with the cable bent repeatedly in the same location. The power brick itself bore 2 small identifying marks, manufacturing stamps that were consistent with Dell's official power supply specifications. She then examined the laptop's cooling vents on the underside. Using a small flashlight, she looked into the vents and observed dust accumulation consistent with regular use. The dust appeared uniform, suggesting the machine had been running in the office environment for an extended period. Margaret documented all of this in her investigation notes. She photographed the wear patterns on the keyboard, the USB port conditions, and the condition of the power adapter. She also recorded the serial number, model, and estimated purchase date. She then prepared to examine the laptop's hard drive. She contacted Gregory Paulson again and asked if he could conduct a forensic analysis of the device's storage without powering it on or risking data loss. Paulson agreed and arranged for a specialized firm to perform the work. 3 days later, the forensic firm delivered a preliminary report. The hard drive contained 287 gigabytes of data, including a complete copy of the bookstore's accounting database, multiple versions of the accounting software's source code, a folder labeled Scripts containing 14 Python scripts designed to automate database modifications, email correspondence with an external consultant discussing API integration. Margaret reviewed the email records. They were contained in an offline backup file on the laptop. The messages dated from June 2023 and discussed obtaining API authentication credentials for the accounting system. The consultant's email was not Paulson's. It was from a different address, support@dataintegrationservices.net. Margaret searched for this consulting firm online. The website was minimal. A single page with contact information and vague descriptions of custom database solutions. The firm had no physical address listed, only an email and a phone number. When Margaret called the number, it was no longer in service. She then examined the Python scripts in detail with assistance from the forensic firm. The scripts contained automated commands designed to 1. Connect to the accounting system's API using hard-coded authentication credentials. 2. Query the current daily sales total. 3. Calculate the difference between actual sales and a predetermined target figure. 4. Modify the monthly closing balance to reflect the difference. 5. Log the transaction in a hidden file. The scripts contained timestamps indicating they had been created over a 6-month period, from March 2023 to August 2023. The final version was dated August 28, 2023, one day before the discovery of the fraud. The forensic firm also recovered deleted files from the hard drive's free space. Among these was a spreadsheet containing a list of dates, cash amounts, and the notation removed or retained. The spreadsheet covered all 28 months and accounted for $47,284 in total transactions, significantly higher than the initial estimate of $18,247. Margaret recalculated the figures. The spreadsheet showed that Rothstein had processed 287 fraudulent return transactions. Of these, approximately 156 had been retained as cash taken from the register. The remaining 131 had been entered but not actually processed, ghost transactions that existed only in the system's records. These ghost transactions created a secondary layer of fraud. They inflated the appearance of return volume, making the bookstore's business appear less profitable than it actually was. This could be useful in future negotiations, loan applications, or tax documentation. Margaret created a comprehensive timeline of Rothstein's activities. December 12, 2021 Rothstein orders 5,000 blank return slips from the printer, paying in cash. The slips are printed with sequential invoice numbers that fall within the bookstore's legitimate range. March 2023 Rothstein begins creating Python scripts on the Dell laptop to automate accounting modifications. March-August 2023 Rothstein executes 287 fraudulent return transactions, removing approximately $47,284 in cash from the register. He uses the automated scripts to adjust the digital accounting records to mask the missing funds. June-August 2023 Rothstein obtains API credentials, likely through contact with the external dataintegrationservices.net consultant, enabling remote access to the system from his home computer. August 28, 2023 Rothstein runs the final automated script, modifying August's closing balance and generating ghost transactions. He then deletes the script from the visible laptop drive, though forensic recovery retrieves it from unallocated disk space. August 29, 2024 the bookstore owner discovers the discrepancy and initiates an investigation. Margaret sat in the office, surrounded by printed copies of the forensic report, email records, and timeline documentation. The fluorescent panels cast their neutral glow across the desk. The evidence had accumulated methodically, each discovery building upon the previous, each piece of data intersecting with physical evidence to create a complete picture of systematic, premeditated theft. The Dell laptop sat in an evidence box on the corner of the desk, its serial number documented and its contents recorded. Outside the office, the bookstore continued its normal operations. Customers moved through the aisles, selecting books from shelves that Rothstein's theft had nearly bankrupted. Margaret opened the email she had received from the forensic firm at 8:43 a.m. on a Friday. The subject line read, "Additional findings, hard drive analysis phase 2." She read through the message slowly, taking notes on a lined pad. The firm had recovered additional deleted files that had been overwritten multiple times, making them difficult to extract. But using specialized recovery techniques, they had reconstructed fragments of a file named accounts_backup_2022.xlsx, a spreadsheet that predated the fraudulent scheme by several months. Margaret requested the recovered file be sent to her immediately. When it arrived, she opened it on her desk computer and examined its contents. The spreadsheet contained detailed transaction records from 2022 showing cash movements, inventory adjustments, and personnel expenses. Most of the data was consistent with what she had seen in the official accounting system. But one section of the spreadsheet, rows 147 through 203, contained a series of entries that did not appear anywhere in the current system records. These entries documented cash payments labeled as consulting fees and special projects. Each entry listed a date, an amount ranging from $800 to $2,100, and a recipient identified only by initials, Dr. Margaret counted the entries, 57 transactions across a 6-month period from March through August 2022, totaling $68,400. The entries were dated irregularly, sometimes 2 or 3 per week, other times with gaps of 10 days. But the total amount suggested this was a separate, undisclosed payment stream. She cross-referenced these dates with the bookstore's official bank records. On each date when a consulting fee payment had been recorded in the deleted spreadsheet, a corresponding withdrawal of the same amount had been made from the bookstore's operating account. However, the bank statements labeled these withdrawals simply as cash, with no description of purpose. Margaret then examined the deleted spreadsheet's metadata, the hidden information embedded in the file that recorded when it was created and last modified. The file was originally created on February 14, 2022. It was last modified on July 19, 2023, approximately 1 month after Rothstein had begun executing the fraudulent return scheme. This timing suggested that Rothstein had accessed an old backup file, reviewed the evidence of the 2022 payments, and then attempted to delete it. The fact that Margaret could recover it meant the deletion had not been thorough. The file had been moved to a recycle folder rather than securely wiped. She then requested bank statements for the period of March through August 2022. When they arrived, she examined each withdrawal marked as cash. The amounts matched exactly with the consulting fees entries in the deleted spreadsheet. The withdrawals followed a pattern. They occurred on specific days of the week, predominantly on Thursdays and Fridays. Margaret noted the dates and amounts. March 17, 2022, $1,400. March 25, 2022, $950. April 1st, 2022, $1,100. April 8th, 2022, $1,200. April 15th, 2022, $1,050. Each withdrawal was made in person at the bookstore's bank branch, according to the transaction notes. The teller's initials were recorded on the statement. LM. Margaret contacted the bank and requested to speak with Linda Martinez, the teller whose initials appeared on the statements. The bank manager informed her that Martinez had left her position in September 2023, approximately 1 month after Rothstein's fraudulent scheme had been discovered. She obtained Martinez's contact information from the bank's human resources file and called her at her new place of employment, a retail store 3 miles away. Martinez agreed to meet with her during her lunch break. At a coffee shop near Martinez's workplace, Margaret presented the bank statements and the deleted spreadsheet entries. She asked Martinez to explain the cash withdrawals marked with her initials. Martinez's response was measured. She stated that these withdrawals had been authorized by the bookstore owner and had been processed according to standard banking procedures. She had no record of anything unusual about the transactions. Margaret then asked whether Rothstein had ever been present during these withdrawals. Martinez paused before responding. She said that Rothstein had accompanied the owner on several occasions to the bank, but she could not recall the specific instances without reviewing her personal records. Margaret requested that Martinez check her personal records, any notes or documentation she might have kept from that period. Martinez said she had discarded most of her work-related materials when she left the position, but she might have retained some receipts or documentation at home. 3 days later, Martinez called Margaret and said she had located a small notebook she had kept during her time at the bank. She agreed to meet again and provided the notebook. Margaret examined the notebook in a quiet booth at the same coffee shop. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in blue ballpoint pen. Most entries recorded routine banking transactions, but several entries, dated between March and August 2022, contained additional notes beside the withdrawal amounts. March 17th, $1,400, Dr. R, present, signed by owner. March 25th, $950, Dr. R requested. April 1st, $1,100, Dr. R, present. April 8th, $1,200, Dr. R, present, asked questions about balance. April 15th, $1,050, Dr. R, present, inquired about previous withdrawals. The initials Dr. R appeared to be shorthand for David Rothstein, suggesting he had used the middle name David along with his surname Rothstein when interacting with the teller. But his employment records listed him as David Rothstein, not Dr. Rothstein. The notation Doctor typically referred to a person with a doctoral degree or a medical professional. Margaret asked Martinez about this notation. Martinez explained that she had used doctor as an abbreviation for David, not as a title. But she recalled that Rothstein had sometimes corrected her, insisting that she address him as Mr. Rothstein rather than using his first name, and she had adopted the abbreviated notation to maintain distance. Margaret then asked about the notation, inquired about previous withdrawals on the April 15th entry. Martinez stated that on that date, Rothstein had asked her to review the bank account's transaction history for the past month. She had provided him with a printed statement showing all withdrawals. He had then asked her to verify the specific amounts and dates of earlier withdrawals, and she had confirmed them from the bank's records. This suggested that Rothstein had been monitoring the cash withdrawals, the payments that would later be labeled as consulting fees in the deleted spreadsheet. He appeared to have known about them and had been actively investigating them. Margaret asked whether Rothstein had inquired about the withdrawal's purpose or destination. Martinez stated that she had not discussed purpose with him, as that information would not be available to her as a teller. But she noted that Rothstein had seemed particularly interested in whether the cash had been withdrawn by the owner personally or whether it could have been transferred to another person. Margaret returned to the bookstore and examined the owner's personal records. The owner stated that she had no recollection of authorizing 57 separate cash withdrawals totaling $68,400 in 2022. She provided access to her personal banking records and accounting files. Margaret reviewed the owner's personal tax returns for 2022. The returns made no mention of consulting fees paid to any individual or firm. The business deduction section listed standard expenses, utilities, inventory, payroll, rent, but no large consulting payments. She then interviewed the owner about the 2022 period. The owner stated that in early 2022, she had employed another assistant manager in addition to Rothstein. This person's name was Michael Hanover. Hanover had worked at the bookstore for approximately 18 months before being terminated in August 2022 due to performance issues. Margaret requested Hanover's employment file. The file contained an application completed in January 2021, performance reviews from 2021 and early 2022, all marked as satisfactory. A termination notice dated August 18, 2022, stating only position eliminated due to business restructuring. A final paycheck stub dated August 31st, 2022. Hanover's listed address on his application was an apartment complex on Ellsworth Avenue, approximately 2 miles from the bookstore. Margaret cross-referenced this address with the IP address that had been associated with Rothstein's API calls to the accounting system. The addresses were different. She then examined Hanover's final paycheck stub. The amount shown was $2,847.18, calculated as regular wages for 2 weeks plus a payout for unused vacation days. The check was printed on the bookstore's official check stock and was signed by the owner. However, the endorsement on the back of the check appeared to have been made by 2 different hands. The first endorsement, written in blue ballpoint pen in a neat, compact cursive, read Michael Hanover. Below this, a second endorsement in black ballpoint pen read David Rothstein as agent. Margaret had seen Rothstein's handwriting multiple times in the return slip records and reconciliation forms. The second endorsement matched his handwriting precisely. This indicated that Rothstein had signed Hanover's final paycheck on Hanover's behalf, despite having no legal authority to do so. She then examined the bank's copy of the endorsement. The bank's records showed that the check had been deposited into the bookstore's operating account on September 2, 2022. But the deposit record indicated a different account had been the payee, an account in the name of D. Rothstein Consulting Services. Margaret contacted the bank and requested all transaction records for the account D. Rothstein Consulting Services. The bank manager stated that no such account existed at their institution. Margaret then requested records of the bookstore's account activity on September 2, 2022. The deposit records showed 1 check deposited, Hanover's final paycheck, $2,847.18, endorsed by both Hanover and Rothstein. The deposit was attributed to Rothstein Consulting Accrual. The funds remained in the account for 2 days before being withdrawn as cash on September 4, 2022. Margaret then examined the deleted spreadsheet again, this time looking at the dates of the consulting fee withdrawals in relation to Hanover's employment. The payments began in March 2022 and continued through August 2022, the exact period during which Hanover worked at the bookstore. She calculated the totals. Cash withdrawals labeled as consulting fees, $68,400. Michael Hanover's total compensation for 18 months of employment, $47,300, calculated from the final paycheck, adjusted for the known monthly salary. Difference, $21,100. The difference was precisely the amount that would be required to account for the discrepancy between what Hanover should have earned and what had actually been withdrawn and paid to him. Margaret hypothesized a scenario. Rothstein had systematically withdrawn cash from the bookstore's account under the guise of consulting fees. A portion of this cash, Hanover's actual wages, had been paid to Hanover in cash, off the books, avoiding payroll taxes and documentation. The remainder had been retained by Rothstein. But this theory required verification. Margaret needed to determine whether Hanover had actually been paid in cash and whether he had been aware of the arrangement. She located Michael Hanover's current address through public records. He was working as a warehouse manager at a logistics company approximately 5 miles from the bookstore. Margaret called and requested a meeting, explaining that she was investigating financial irregularities at his former place of employment. Hanover agreed to meet at a coffee shop near his workplace at 4:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. When they met, Margaret presented Hanover with copies of the bank statements showing the cash withdrawals and the employment records showing his termination date and final paycheck. She asked him to explain his understanding of his compensation arrangement at the bookstore. Hanover's response was careful and methodical. He stated that he had been hired at a salary of $2,650 per month, payable via direct deposit to his personal bank account. However, he had never received any direct deposits from the bookstore. Instead, approximately 1 week after each monthly pay period ended, Rothstein had provided him with cash, typically in the range of $2,400 to $2,800 per month. Hanover stated that Rothstein had explained this arrangement as a tax optimization strategy, allowing Hanover to avoid some tax burden while the bookstore avoided certain payroll processing fees. Hanover had accepted this explanation at the time, though he later realized it was highly irregular. Margaret asked Hanover to describe the mechanics of these cash payments. Hanover stated that Rothstein would take him aside during a break and hand him an envelope containing cash. The amounts were never documented, and no receipt or acknowledgement was provided. Hanover had simply accepted the cash and used it for his living expenses. Margaret then asked whether Hanover had been aware that the bookstore had claimed to the bank that this money was being paid for consulting services rather than as his wage. Hanover stated that he had not been aware of any such documentation until this moment. Margaret inquired whether Hanover had received his final paycheck as documented in the employment file. Hanover stated that he had not. He had been terminated verbally by the owner on August 18, 2022, and had been told to leave the premises immediately. He had received no final compensation of any kind, no check, no cash, no payout for unused vacation days. This meant that the final paycheck of $2,847.18 that appeared in the bank records had been cashed or deposited by Rothstein, and Hanover had never received those funds. The amount was a direct theft, distinct from the systematic cash embezzlement that had occurred across the 18-month period. Margaret asked Hanover to provide any documentation he had retained from his employment, pay stubs, emails, or notes that might corroborate his account. Hanover produced several items from a folder he brought with him. 4 handwritten notes from Rothstein, each dated to a specific month and showing a cash amount to be paid. A personal calendar where Hanover had recorded the dates he received cash payments and the amounts. Text messages between Hanover and Rothstein, sent through a personal messaging application, discussing the cash payment arrangement. Margaret photographed all of these documents. The handwritten notes were in Rothstein's distinctive handwriting, matching the notes she had seen on the bank teller's notebook and the return slip documents. The calendar showed entries spanning from March 2022 through August 2022, with a total of 54 cash payment dates recorded. She then asked Hanover whether he had filed any complaint with labor authorities or law enforcement regarding his termination or the non-payment of his final wages. Hanover stated that he had not, partly because the arrangement had been unusual enough that he was unsure whether it was technically legal, and partly because his new employment had provided sufficient income that he had not pursued the matter further. Margaret informed Hanover that his situation appeared to constitute wage theft, and that his testimony would be valuable in the ongoing investigation. She provided him with contact information for a labor attorney and recommended he consider filing a formal complaint. She returned to the bookstore with the documentation Hanover had provided. Margaret now understood that the fraud extended beyond Rothstein's direct embezzlement. His actions had also created a system of wage theft targeting another employee, diverting what should have been documented taxable compensation into cash payments that remained unrecorded. Margaret began constructing a revised timeline. January 2021 Michael Hanover is hired at a salary of $2,650 per month. He is supposed to receive direct deposit payments to his bank account. March 2022 rather than making direct deposit payments, Rothstein begins withdrawing large amounts of cash from the bookstore's account, labeled as consulting fees. He provides portions of this cash to Hanover as unrecorded wage payments. March-August 2022 Rothstein continues the systematic cash withdrawals, paying Hanover in cash while retaining the remainder. Over 6 months, $68,400 is withdrawn. Approximately $47,300 is paid to Hanover. Rothstein retains approximately $21,100. August 18th, 2022 Hanover is terminated verbally and immediately escorted from the premises. He receives no final compensation. September 4th, 2022 Rothstein deposits Hanover's final paycheck, which was never given to Hanover, into the bookstore's account and immediately withdraws it as cash. December 2021 Rothstein orders fraudulent return slips. March-August 2023 Rothstein executes the fraudulent return scheme, removing an additional $47,284 through false refunds recorded in the system. Margaret documented all of this in her investigation file. She prepared a comprehensive report detailing 1. The systematic embezzlement of cash through fraudulent return transactions, $47,284. 2. The earlier theft of cash labeled as consulting fees, including wage theft from Michael Hanover, $21,100. 3. The unauthorized use of Hanover's identity and signature on financial documents. 4. The unauthorized API access to the accounting system obtained through external consultants. 5. The creation and use of fraudulent return slip documents. 6. The alteration of digital accounting records to mask the missing cash. The total amount of documented theft and fraud exceeded $68,000, with additional unquantified losses from the consulting fees arrangement and the system manipulation. Margaret sat in the office on a Friday afternoon, the report spread across the desk before her. The fluorescent panels above cast their constant illumination across the paper. Outside, the bookstore sales continued. Customers moving through shelves stocked with merchandise purchased with revenue that a former employee had methodically redirected into his own accounts. She began the process of compiling all physical evidence into organized boxes. The fraudulent return slips, the Dell laptop with its recovered files, the bank statements, the teller's notebook, the handwritten notes from Rothstein, Michael Hanover's calendar, and text messages. Each item was photographed, cataloged, and stored in acid-free folders to preserve it for the legal proceedings that would inevitably follow. Margaret sat at the desk on Monday morning, April 14th, 2026, with all compiled evidence arranged before her in chronological order. 23 months of investigation had accumulated into 14 bankers' boxes, each containing sorted documents, photographs, and analysis. She had already submitted preliminary reports to the bookstore owner and to the police department's Financial Crimes Division. The detective assigned to the case had informed her that charges were being prepared, but the investigation remained technically open pending her final synthesis of motive and intent. She began reviewing the complete timeline again, not to find new information. The facts had been established months ago, but to understand the narrative arc that connected them. The evidence told a story of escalation. It began with smaller thefts and evolved into a sophisticated technological fraud. But the origin point still remained somewhat obscure. Why had Rothstein begun this scheme? What had prompted the initial decision to withdraw cash and claim it as consulting fees in 2022? Margaret pulled out the employment records for both Rothstein and Hanover again. She examined the dates carefully. Rothstein had been employed at the bookstore since 2014, 8 years without apparent incident. His performance reviews were consistently positive. Hanover had been hired in January 2021. For the first year, the arrangement had apparently been routine. But in early 2022, approximately 8 months into Hanover's employment, the cash withdrawal scheme had begun. She then pulled out the deleted spreadsheet file and examined its metadata more carefully. The file had been created on February 14th, 2022. The date struck her as significant. She checked the bank records for that week. There was an unusual transaction on February 18th, 2022, a transfer of funds from the bookstore's operating account to a personal savings account held in Rothstein's name, $8,500. The bookstore owner had stated earlier that she had not authorized this transfer. Margaret requested transaction confirmation documents from the bank. The bank provided a copy of the transfer authorization form. The form bore 2 signatures, the bookstore owner's and David Rothstein's. Margaret compared the owner's signature on the transfer form to her signature on other documents. The signatures matched perfectly. This meant the owner had actually authorized the transfer, or her signature had been forged with exceptional precision. Margaret requested to meet with the bookstore owner again. She asked directly whether she had authorized the $8,500 transfer on February 18, 2022. The owner examined the document carefully and stated with certainty that she had not. She stated that her signature appeared to be hers, but she had no recollection of signing any authorization for this transfer. Margaret then examined the transfer form's physical properties. She placed it under a magnifying glass and examined the signature in minute detail. The pen pressure, the letter formations, and the connecting strokes all appeared consistent with the owner's documented signatures. But when compared to other signatures from the same period, Margaret noticed a subtle difference. The signature on the transfer form appeared to be slightly larger than the owner's typical signature, and the slope of the letters was marginally different, approximately 2 degrees steeper than usual. This could indicate one of two possibilities. Either the owner's signing technique had changed slightly on that specific day, or the signature had been forged by someone with extensive familiarity with her handwriting. Margaret requested that the bank provide the original transfer form rather than a photocopy. The bank retrieved the original document from its archived records. Examining the original form under natural light and magnification, Margaret could observe additional details. The signature had been made with ballpoint pen, and the ink pressure had been heavy and consistent, more consistent than a natural signature would typically be. A natural signature often shows variation in pressure as the pen is lifted and replaced, but this signature showed uniform pressure throughout, suggesting the signatory had not lifted the pen during the formation of the letters. This was characteristic of a forged signature made by someone attempting to replicate another person's handwriting with meticulous care. The forger had practiced the signature enough to replicate it with high accuracy, but not enough to replicate the natural variations in pressure that occurred during an authentic signature. Margaret then examined Rothstein's handwriting samples from the same period. She pulled return slip records, reconciliation forms, and the handwritten notes from the teller's notebook, all dated from February through April 2022. She began comparing the letter formations to the signature on the transfer form. The individual letters in the transfer form's signature showed characteristics consistent with Rothstein's handwriting. The specific way he formed the letter R, the distinctive loop on the T, the compressed spacing between letters. But when she compared the overall signature to Rothstein's known signatures from other documents, they did not match. Rothstein's authentic signatures showed greater variation in size and pressure. Margaret realized she was examining a forged signature, but she could not conclusively determine the forger's identity based solely on handwriting analysis. However, the authorization form provided a different kind of evidence. She examined the form's registration number and date. All bank authorization forms were issued sequentially, with each form bearing a unique control number. The form for the $8,500 transfer showed control number 47291, dated February 18, 2022. Margaret requested a list of all authorization forms issued to the bookstore during that month. The bank provided records showing forms 47,275 through 47310 had been issued to the bookstore between February 1st and February 28th. But Margaret noticed a discrepancy. The bookstore's records showed that only 3 authorization forms had been used during February 2022, 2 for routine account transfers, and 1 to add a signatory to the account. The control numbers for these 3 forms were 47277, 47288, and 47305. The form with control number 47291, the one used for the $8,500 transfer to Rothstein, did not appear in the bookstore's official records. Margaret requested that the bank provide the complete history of all forms issued to all customers with control numbers between 47,275 and 47310. The bank provided a log showing which customers had received each form. Control number 47291 had been issued not to the bookstore, but to a different business account, a consulting firm called Data Integration Services. Margaret's entire understanding of the timeline shifted. The transfer authorization form with Rothstein's forged signature had not been created by the bookstore. It had been created by the consulting firm that would later provide Rothstein with API access to the accounting system. The control number proved this. The form belonged to Data Integration Services, not to the bookstore. This meant that someone at Data Integration Services had obtained a transfer authorization form intended for their use and had altered it to redirect funds from the bookstore's account. The signature had been forged to make it appear that the bookstore owner had authorized the transfer. The recipient account listed on the form, Rothstein's personal account, suggested either that Rothstein was complicit in the scheme or that his name had been used without his knowledge. Margaret then requested complete records for the Data Integration Services account at the bank. The account had been opened on January 15, 2022, by an individual named Thomas Brennan. The account received several deposits from different businesses throughout February and March 2022, all associated with database consulting and system integration services. Margaret searched for Thomas Brennan online. She found a LinkedIn profile listing him as an independent software consultant with experience in database administration and API integration. His profile photograph showed a man in his early 40s. His work history included positions at several technology companies, with a final entry showing self-employed consultant 2021 present. Margaret requested that the police department's Financial Crimes Division obtain a warrant for Data Integration Services' complete financial records. When those records were provided, they revealed a pattern. The company had invoiced numerous small businesses for consulting services related to accounting system integration. The invoices ranged from $1,200 to $3,800. Most of these invoices had been paid promptly by their respective clients. However, the bookstore had never been invoiced by Data Integration Services. The $8,500 transfer represented the only money the bookstore had ever paid to this entity, and it had been transferred through a fraudulent authorization form, not through a legitimate invoice and payment process. Margaret then examined the source of the API credentials that Rothstein had used to access the bookstore's accounting system remotely. The forensic analysis had revealed that Rothstein's Dell laptop contained authentication credentials granted by Data Integration Services. But who exactly had issued these credentials? She requested that the police department subpoena the complete email records from the Data Integration Services account. The emails revealed communications between Thomas Brennan and numerous small business owners, offering database integration services. In one email chain, dated June 2023, there was communication between Brennan and an address d.rothstein.admin@protonmail.com. The exchange was brief. From support@dataintegrationservices.net, Thomas Brennan, to d.rothstein.admin@protonmail.com. Date, June 15, 2023. Subject, API credentials, bookstore system. Per our conversation, credentials attached. Access will allow you to execute custom queries and modify fields as discussed. Payment of $2,400 due upon confirmation of successful access test, using the routing method we established. From d.rothstein.admin@protonmail.com to support@dataintegrationservices.net. Date, June 17, 2023. Subject, API credentials, bookstore system. Confirmed. System access verified. Payment ready as discussed. This email chain established that Rothstein and Thomas Brennan had a prior relationship and had agreed to specific terms regarding API access and payment. But the payment of $2,400 did not appear anywhere in the bookstore's records or in any of Rothstein's bank accounts that had been examined. Margaret then returned to the deleted spreadsheet and the cash withdrawals. She examined the pattern of withdrawals again. The amounts ranged from $950 to $2,100. but certain amounts appeared with unusual frequency. The amount $2,400 appeared exactly once, on July 22, 2023, 5 days after Rothstein's email confirming successful system access. This transaction had been recorded in the system as a consulting fee withdrawal, despite occurring 18 months after the consulting fee scheme had supposedly ended. The $2,400 withdrawal was the payment owed to Thomas Brennan for the API credentials. Margaret now understood the complete sequence. In January 2022, Rothstein had somehow made contact with Thomas Brennan, the independent consultant. The two had discussed a scheme. Brennan would help Rothstein access the bookstore's accounting system remotely, bypassing normal security protocols. In return, Rothstein would pay Brennan a fee. To establish this relationship and demonstrate Rothstein's ability to access substantial cash, Brennan had created a fraudulent transfer authorization form using a legitimate form from his own business account. He had forged the bookstore owner's signature and directed the $8,500 transfer to Rothstein's personal account. This served two purposes. It demonstrated to Brennan that Rothstein had access to the bookstore's funds, and it provided Rothstein with immediate cash to fund the initial phase of the scheme. But this created a problem. Rothstein could not explain the $8,500 transfer to the bookstore owner without admitting to fraud. So he had to create a narrative that would account for the missing money. The solution was the consulting fees scheme, creating a fiction that the bookstore had authorized payments to external consultants. The $8,500 transfer was then hidden within the larger pattern of monthly consulting fee withdrawals. However, the legitimate consulting fee scheme, the payments to Hanover, was not initiated by Brennan. That appeared to be Rothstein's own corruption of an employee, using the cash he had obtained to build a system of loyalty and complicity. By paying Hanover in undocumented cash, Rothstein was establishing a pattern of unreported transactions that would help obscure the later fraudulent return scheme. The fraudulent return slips, ordered in December 2021, provided the mechanism for the larger theft. And the API credentials obtained from Brennan in June 2023 provided the technological sophistication needed to automate the fraudulent return adjustments, making them harder to detect. Margaret examined one final set of evidence: the recovered text messages and emails on the Dell laptop. She searched for any additional communication between Rothstein and Brennan. She found a single file named Brennan_notes.txt that had been recovered by the forensic firm. The file contained fragmented notes, apparently written by Rothstein, documenting the agreed-upon arrangement. B. Claims he can bypass normal auth requirements using direct API access. $2,400 payment. Can use same method for others if needed. Must discuss discretion account monitoring. Previous work. Did same for 3 other businesses. All consulting fee modifications. B. Experienced, not first time. This note revealed that Thomas Brennan had conducted similar schemes for at least 3 other businesses. He had established a model: identify a vulnerable employee with access to financial systems, provide them with technical tools to bypass security controls, and facilitate cash payments that could be masked as legitimate business expenses. Rothstein had been selected as a target because of his long tenure at the bookstore, his access to the accounting system, and his position of trust with the owner. Brennan had initiated contact and proposed the scheme. The fraudulent transfer authorization had served as both a proof of concept and a financial incentive for Rothstein to proceed. Margaret understood Rothstein's motive now. It was not based on financial desperation or a sudden crisis. Rather, it appeared to be an escalating pattern of opportunism. Rothstein had discovered that the bookstore's owner was inattentive to detailed financial management. The bank's teller had noted that Rothstein asked questions about account balances and transaction histories. He had been probing the boundaries of what he could access and what might go undetected. When Thomas Brennan had contacted him, either directly or through an intermediary, with an offer to exploit the system, Rothstein had accepted because the opportunity had been presented to him by someone with technical expertise and experience in exactly this type of fraud. The initial $8,500 transfer had lowered Rothstein's threshold for committing larger frauds. Once he had successfully stolen money without immediate detection, the psychological barrier to larger thefts had diminished. The wage theft of Michael Hanover served multiple purposes in Rothstein's reasoning. It provided a secondary victim whose stolen compensation could be partially retained. It established a pattern of cash transactions that would blend with future fraudulent withdrawals, and it created a system of obligation with another employee that might be useful for future schemes. By the time the fraudulent return slip scheme was fully operational in 2023, Rothstein had already committed to a criminal trajectory. The scheme had escalated naturally from the initial $8,500 fraud to systematic theft exceeding $47,000. Margaret sat back in the office chair and synthesized the final narrative. Thomas Brennan was the initiator and architect. He had identified vulnerable businesses and employees, offered them technical tools and financial incentives, and facilitated frauds that benefited both him and his targets. Rothstein was a willing participant who, once compromised by the initial fraudulent transfer, had committed increasingly serious crimes. The motive was straightforward: greed and the intoxication of successfully committing crimes without immediate consequence. Rothstein had not stolen because he needed the money. He had stolen because he could, and because the progression from petty fraud to larger theft had been so gradual that each step had seemed like a minor escalation rather than a fundamental crossing of a moral boundary. Margaret prepared the final report. She documented the connection between Thomas Brennan and David Rothstein, the fraudulent transfer authorization form, the API credentials, the payment of $2,400, and the complete timeline of fraud spanning from February 2022 through August 2024. She then made a single phone call to the detective assigned to the case. She stated that she had identified two perpetrators: David Rothstein, the former clerk, and Thomas Brennan, the independent consultant who had provided both the financial incentive and the technical means for the crime. She provided the detective with the complete documentation package and recommended charges of theft, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The detective asked whether Margaret had any remaining questions or loose ends. Margaret reviewed her notes one final time. All evidence had been documented, photographed, and properly preserved. All transactions had been traced. All relationships between the perpetrators had been established through documentary evidence. She responded to the detective that the investigation was complete. The paper trail was unbroken. The motive was evident. The perpetrators were identified. She ended the call and began the process of filing the final report with the police department. As she typed the concluding paragraph, she reflected on the mechanics of the crime. It had not required brilliance or technical sophistication beyond what an independent consultant with database experience could provide. It had required only opportunity, access, and the absence of adequate financial oversight by the bookstore owner. The owner had trusted her employee. That trust, combined with inattentiveness to monthly reconciliation details, had created the conditions for systematic theft. A more vigilant owner would have detected the discrepancies within weeks. The fact that the fraud had continued for 28 months was not a testament to Rothstein's skill, but to the owner's neglect. Margaret saved the final report and sent it to the police department at 3:41 p.m. on Monday afternoon. The investigation was concluded. The evidence was filed. The perpetrators were identified and documented. She removed the banker's boxes from the desk and arranged them on shelves in a storage closet. The physical manifestations of 23 months of methodical investigation, receipts, photographs, spreadsheets, recovered files, handwriting samples, bank statements, and documentation of systematic human dishonesty were now reduced to archived boxes awaiting disposition in whatever criminal proceedings would follow. The bookstore would recover financially. Insurance would likely cover most of the theft. The owner would implement stronger controls. Michael Hanover might file a civil claim for wage theft and emotional distress. The other businesses that Thomas Brennan had defrauded might come forward once his crimes were public. Margaret powered down her desktop computer and prepared to leave the office. The case was closed. The investigation was finished. The accumulation of mundane facts, signatures, timestamps, withdrawal amounts, deleted files, forensic recoveries, had assembled into an undeniable narrative of premeditated fraud extending across 3 independent criminal acts and 2 perpetrators working toward a common goal of systematic asset theft. She locked the office door behind her and walked through the bookstore toward the exit. The shelves remained stocked with inventory. Customers moved through the aisles. Business continued. The fraud had been discovered, investigated, and documented. Justice would proceed through channels beyond her purview. The cold afternoon light filtered through the storefront windows as Margaret stepped onto the street. The case was resolved. The paper trail was complete. The truth had emerged not through intuition or dramatic revelation, but through the slow, methodical accumulation of facts, each one ordinary, each one verifiable, each one contributing to a complete portrait of systematic human dishonesty. Story 3. A woman discovered a small GPS tracker taped inside her car's wheel well after noticing the same silver sedan appeared behind her every time she left her office for 3 weeks straight. The GPS tracker sat on the kitchen counter under the fluorescent light, a matte black rectangle approximately 7 centimeters long, its weight substantial, roughly 85 grams. The adhesive residue still covered one side, dried to a tan crust. Margaret examined it under magnification. The serial number printed on the back read, TRK 4829X, VZ. She photographed it with her phone, the timestamp marking 1437. 3 weeks of observation. The silver sedan, a 2019 Subaru Outback, license plate partially obscured, had appeared in her office parking lot at variable intervals. Sometimes 8:02 in the morning, sometimes 9:54. The tracker itself was a commercial model, available through 3 different vendors online. The purchase history was inaccessible to her, but the model documentation listed a manufacturer in Taiwan with American distribution through a company called Apex Fleet Solutions. She turned her attention to her vehicle's documentation. Her 2014 Honda CR-V, purchased in cash 18 months ago, had a clear title. The service records from the dealer showed routine maintenance, oil changes, tire rotations, 1 brake pad replacement. The next logical step was the wheel well itself. The driver's side rear wheel well showed the tape residue clearly, rectangular in shape, approximately 15 centimeters by 8 centimeters. The adhesive had degraded unevenly, suggesting the tracker had been in place for between 2 and 4 weeks, given the typical adhesion curve of 3M industrial tape. Alongside the residue were 3 fibers, 2 black synthetic, likely from the vehicle's undercarriage coating, 1 pale blue nylon, the kind used in certain brands of packing tape. She moved to her office building. Security footage from the garage revealed the tracker's installation date, 19 days prior, at 5:43 a.m., timestamp verified by the building's system clock. The footage was grainy, but the installer, gloved, hooded, spent exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds bent beside the wheel well. The individual's build suggested 170 centimeters in height, approximately 75 kilograms. No clear facial features. The clothing bore a small emblem on the left shoulder, a logo Margaret recognized from delivery services. Her bank statements arrived the next morning. She reviewed 3 months of activity. There it was, a charge from Apex Fleet Solutions, dated 16 days prior. The amount, $127.50. She had not authorized this charge. The transaction listed a billing address in Newark, Delaware. She had never been to Delaware. Margaret then examined her credit card more closely. The physical card had been replaced 6 months ago due to a manufacturing defect. She still possessed the old one, stored in a drawer with expired documents. The old card's number was 4127-**********8934. The new card, 4127-************8947. A 3-digit variance. She cross-referenced her records. A charge to Apex Fleet Solutions appeared on both cards, using both numbers, on the same day, 16 days prior. 2 identical charges. The sum, $255. The implication calculated quickly. Someone had either stolen her old card number from the deactivated card in her possession, or someone at the card issuer's office had documented both numbers before the old card was properly destroyed. She called the bank. The representative confirmed the old card had been shredded on the date of issuance for the new card. The shredding facility was contracted through a third-party vendor in New Jersey. She then examined her car's odometer. The service records documented mileage at each appointment. 14 days prior, the odometer read 127,443 kilometers. 2 days ago, it read 127,891 kilometers, a difference of 448 kilometers. She had driven approximately 312 kilometers in that period based on her own trip log, a discrepancy of 136 kilometers unaccounted for. The fuel consumption didn't match. Her tank had consumed 18 liters for 312 kilometers of known driving, but 23 liters had been purchased in the same 2-day window. The math demanded explanation. The night before, she had left her keys on the kitchen counter while she showered. The back door lock showed no visible tampering, but the mechanism required 4.2 kilograms of pressure to turn the key, slightly higher than the 3.8 kilograms of pressure it had required 2 weeks prior, when she last noticed the resistance. Someone had copied her key, most likely through impression. A professional job. Her insurance policy arrived at the door the following morning, unordered. She had never contacted an insurer for the vehicle. The policy was a high-coverage, full protection plan, set to activate in 3 days. The beneficiary listed was her employer's corporation, not her personally. The premium had been paid in advance, $2,400. She had not made this payment. On her nightstand lay her phone. She reviewed the location history, toggled off 3 months prior. It was off. Yet her recent location data, the kind generated by apps and search queries, showed patterns. Her office address appeared in her Google search history, though she had never searched for it. The searches were dated 18 days prior, originating from an IP address registered to a corporate network in Newark, Delaware. Margaret sat in the darkened living room, the tracker still on the counter, catching the city light from the window. She had accumulated facts, serial numbers, timestamps, financial records, physical measurements, chemical compositions of adhesives. The silver sedan had not appeared in the past 4 days. The surveillance had been methodical, expensive, and incomplete. The perpetrator or perpetrators had made errors. The duplicate charges, the unshredded card documentation, the oversized key blank that required adjustment. She opened her laptop. The warrant for the card issuer's records would be necessary. The security footage from the parking garage could be forwarded to the police. The Apex Fleet Solutions company registration would be traced. 3 days remained before the insurance policy activated. 3 days to determine whether she was the intended victim of fraud, theft, or something more specific, an inventory count. The weight of the tracker pressed into her palm. She set it down again and turned off the light. Margaret began with the insurance policy. The document lay on her kitchen table, printed on standard 20-pound paper, the kind distributed by corporate carriers nationwide. She measured the font. 11-point times New Roman for the body text, 14-point bold for headers. The policy number was PHX 2847 B19 KL. She called the issuer's verification line at 9:23 a.m. The representative on the phone, a woman with a voice that suggested mid-afternoon fatigue despite the early hour, confirmed the policy existed in their system. However, the activation date in their records was marked as pending, not 3 days hence, but rather 6 days prior. The discrepancy was 9 days. The representative transferred her to a supervisor. The supervisor, a man named Rothschild, pulled the full file. The policy had been initiated by telephone on the date marked 6 days prior at 14:16. The call had originated from Margaret's own phone number. She was holding that phone in her hand. She had made no such call. The audio recording of the call was available upon request through the legal department. Rothschild would require a police report number first. Margaret hung up and opened her phone's call history. The call log showed no outgoing call to the insurance company on that date. She examined the detailed usage statistics through her carrier's website. A call had been placed from her number to the insurance company's main line, lasting 7 minutes and 43 seconds at 14:16 on the recorded date. The call did not appear in her local phone log. The deletion had been precise, a single entry removed from the system, with no trace of recovery possible through standard methods. She then examined her employer's corporate directory. Her office address was listed as Suite 340, the 3rd floor of the Merchant Tower on Hammond Street. She had never worked in Suite 340. Her actual office was Suite 204, 2nd floor, in the same building but a different wing. The directory entry had been updated 18 days prior, the same timestamp as the Google searches originating from Newark, Delaware. Her supervisor, when called at 9:54 a.m., confirmed she worked in Suite 204. The directory had been corrected, she was told, after a brief clerical error. The person who reported the error was unknown. It had been corrected through an online form, password protected, using her own login credentials. Margaret accessed the building's security system through her employee portal. The badge access logs for the past month displayed her entries and exits. 8:31 a.m. arrival, 5:16 p.m. departure, standard weekday patterns. However, the access logs for Suite 340 showed 7 entries made using her badge credentials between the dates of 19 days prior and 4 days prior. The entries were logged at 3:04 a.m., 2:47 a.m., for 19 a.m., 2:31 a.m., 3:52 a.m., 2:18 a.m., and 4:01 a.m. She had not been in the building at any of these times. The badge reader at Suite 340 recorded a photograph with each scan. All 7 photographs showed the same individual, the same hooded figure from the parking garage security footage, gloved, face obscured, build consistent with 170 centimeters and 75 kilograms. The suite's occupant was a firm called Ashford Capital Management, a division of investment services. Margaret had no connection to the company. She called the building management office. The suite had been leased for 8 months, she was told, signed by an individual named Harold Brennan. The lease agreement was available for inspection. She collected it the following morning at 10:13 a.m. The lease was 23 pages, printed on corporate letterhead from a legal services company in Wilmington, Delaware. The signature of Harold Brennan appeared on pages 1, 15, and 23. Margaret examined the signatures under magnification. The first signature, page 1, showed consistent pen pressure, uniform letter formation, and a natural baseline angle of 8 degrees to the right. Page 15 showed the same characteristics. Page 23 showed a baseline angle of 11 degrees, slightly lighter pen pressure on the final letters, and a subtle variation in the capital H that suggested a different hand, or the same hand under different conditions. The discrepancy was approximately 2 millimeters across the full signature width. She researched Harold Brennan. A man by that name existed in the Delaware Business Registry, age 52, with an address in Brandywine 100. She called the address. A woman answered and stated that Harold Brennan had died 4 years prior. She asked how Margaret had obtained his name. Margaret hung up. The lease agreement listed banking details for rent payments. Checks were to be made to Ashford Capital Management, mailed to a P.O. box in Wilmington. Margaret visited the Merchant Towers financial office. The building management confirmed that checks had been received and deposited. She requested copies. 17 checks, spanning 8 months, totaled $34,000. Each check was signed by the same Harold Brennan signature, but the handwriting on the memo line, subtle variations in letter height, spacing, and slant, suggested multiple hands had written the notations. One check, dated 12 days prior, bore a notation written in blue ballpoint ink. Margaret examined it under the building's desk lamp. The notation read, "Monthly," in a script that suggested left-handed writing, the smudging pattern consistent with the writer's hand dragging across wet ink. The handwriting analyst at the police department would not be available until the following week. Instead, Margaret reviewed the building's visitor logs. Ashford Capital Management received deliveries and visitors listed under the name of 2 individuals, Harold Brennan and a woman named Patricia Hoffman. Hoffman appeared in the logs 34 times over the 8-month period. Margaret searched for her in public records. A Patricia Hoffman, age 47, worked in accounts receivable for a company called Nexus Distribution, located in Newark, Delaware. Her LinkedIn profile showed a photograph, sharp features, dark hair, the same build visible in the parking garage footage. The photograph had been taken 2 years prior. Margaret pulled Nexus Distribution's corporate records. The company processed payment collections and account management for approximately 200 client accounts, including insurance companies, financial services, and credit card issuers. The company's own financial records, filed with the state, showed a subsidiary established 8 months prior. Ashford Capital Management registered to an address in Brandywine 100 that matched the dead man's home. The connection formed gradually, without drama. No epiphany, only the accumulation of verified facts. Margaret opened a new document on her laptop and began writing a chronology. The formation date of Ashford Capital, the date of the lease agreement, the date of the first unauthorized access to Suite 340, the date of the first charge to her credit cards, the dates of the vehicle surveillance. Each fact aligned with the next, like gears meshing. She printed the chronology and placed it beside the GPS tracker. Tomorrow she would visit the police department with both documents. The audit of Nexus Distribution's account records would follow. The investigation would proceed through proper channels, through warrant applications and subpoenas, through the slow, deliberate machinery of law enforcement. The office building was quiet at 11:31 p.m. when Margaret finally left. The hallway lights hummed at a frequency she had never noticed before, a steady 60 hertz, the sound of infrastructure, the sound of systems operating beneath the surface where most people never looked. Detective Sarah Kessler received Margaret at the precinct on a Tuesday morning at 10:04 a.m. The office was fluorescent lit, institutional gray, with the ambient noise of phones and keyboard strikes forming a constant low frequency. Kessler was a woman in her early 50s, with the kind of posture that suggested 28 years of sitting in uncomfortable chairs. She reviewed the documents, the chronology, the lease agreement, the check copies, the insurance policy, in silence, her eyes moving methodically across each page. "You've done thorough work," Kessler said. The observation was neutral, without inflection. She did not look up from the lease agreement. The signature variation on page 23. "Did you have it professionally analyzed?" "No," Margaret replied. "The discrepancy is visual. The angle changed approximately 3 degrees. Kessler nodded and set the page down. She pulled a file from her desk drawer, a standard manila folder, the kind that weighed approximately 340 grams when full of documents. "We've had Nexus Distribution under observation for 3 months. Not for fraud, for something else." She opened the folder and extracted a photograph. It showed a warehouse, industrial cinder block, loading dock with a metal door. No identifying markers. "That's their facility in Wilmington," Kessler said. 2 weeks ago, we executed a search warrant. We found 47 vehicles registered to shell companies, all with similar tracking devices to the one removed from your wheel well. 23 of those vehicles belong to individuals employed by financial institutions, banks, credit card companies, insurance firms. One of those individuals is a woman named Patricia Hoffman. Margaret observed the second photograph that Kessler laid down. It showed an office space, desk, filing cabinets. On the desk lay stacks of documents, what appeared to be credit card statements, bank records, insurance forms. The photograph's timestamp read 1347, approximately 6 days prior. Hoffman worked in accounts receivable at Nexus Distribution, Kessler continued. But that was the cover. What she actually did was coordinate access to client databases. Insurance companies, financial institutions. Nexus has contracts with all of them for payment processing. The contracts gave employees like Hoffman Network access to specific systems. She used that access to modify records, create false accounts, redirect payments. Margaret calculated the scope. How many victims? We're still determining that. 83 confirmed so far. The pattern was consistent. Select a target who worked for a company that had substantial assets or account access. Track them, document their movements and habits. install tracking devices in their vehicles, then clone their credit cards, forge their signatures, and create shadow accounts using their identity. The fraudulent charges were small, under $300 each, so they didn't trigger immediate fraud alerts. The victim usually didn't notice for weeks. The insurance policy, Margaret said. Why was I added as a target for insurance fraud? We found that out this morning. Kessler extracted another document from the folder. It was a printed email, the header showing it originated from Margaret's corporate email account, dated 16 days prior, sent at 9:32 a.m. The email was addressed to Patricia Hoffman and contained the subject line, Account Access Request. The body of the email read, "Can you process my updated beneficiary information for my corporate life insurance? New beneficiary, Ashford Capital Management. Policy amount, $500,000. Margaret had not written this email. The signature block used her name and title correctly, but the email address header, the underlying metadata that most users never examined, showed the message had originated from an IP address in Wilmington, Delaware, routed through a VPN service that masked the true origin point. They were preparing to take out a life insurance policy in your name, Kessler said. Large amount, short contestability period. The policy activation they initiated was the first step. Once it was active, they would have submitted a claim, an accident, most likely. Vehicle collision. The claim would be paid to Ashford Capital Management because that's the beneficiary they listed in the forged request. You would have discovered it only after the money was gone, if you discovered it at all. Margaret sat in silence. The mathematics of it extended further. The 136 kilometers of unaccounted driving. That was a test run, a rehearsal. The silver sedan surveilling her movements was establishing baseline patterns for the accident scenario. The unshredded credit card at the card issuer's office was negligence on their part, but it had enabled the duplicate charges that established spending patterns. There's more, Kessler said. She pulled a second folder from her desk. We accessed Hoffman's personal computer. She kept detailed records of every target, every operation, every step. The information is encrypted, but our tech team has made progress. For your case specifically, we found a timeline document. Kessler extracted a photograph of a computer screen printed on standard office paper. It showed a spreadsheet with Margaret's name in the header row. The columns read, Target ID, Initial Access, Database Clone, Card Compromise, Identity Documents, Insurance Policy, Incident Date, Claim Submission. The final two cells contained dates. The incident date was projected for 23 days in the future, the day after the insurance policy's contestability period would expire. The claim submission date was scheduled for 5 days after that. They had a timeline, Kessler said. The incident was planned. The tracking device was their way of learning your route patterns so they could stage the accident on a road where they could control the scenario. The silver sedan you observed, that was positioning. They were mapping traffic patterns, identifying intersections with limited camera coverage, places where a collision could happen and be documented as accidental. Margaret examined the printed spreadsheet. The resolution was low, the photograph slightly out of focus, but the data was legible. She observed a detail in the lower right corner of the screen, a partially visible cell showing a date calculation. The formula bar displayed, equals E7 plus 42. The reference pointed to a cell in a previous row. The mathematics suggested a 42-day cycle, the duration of the contestability period plus a buffer for claims processing. We recovered Hoffman's vehicle records, Kessler continued. She rented a silver Subaru Outback for the surveillance period. The rental agreement shows she intended to extend the rental for another 8 days. The extension would have carried through the incident date you see on that spreadsheet. Where is she now? Margaret asked. In custody. We arrested her 4 days ago, along with 2 other employees from Nexus Distribution and 1 individual from the insurance company's claims department. His name is Martin Ashford. That's where the shell company got its name. He was the one who would have processed your claim. The insurance company is conducting an internal audit to determine how he was hired and what access he was given. Kessler closed the second folder. The sound of the paper and cardboard was dry, conclusive. We're still identifying additional victims. The spreadsheets show at least 6 other targets in active planning stages. 2 of those individuals are still unaware they're being tracked. Margaret observed the office around her, the gray walls, the institutional lighting, the files containing other people's compromised identities. What happens to my case from here? We file charges: fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, attempted grand larceny. The evidence is substantial. The forensic data from Hoffman's computer, combined with the physical evidence, the tracking device, the badge access logs, the vehicle rental records, gives us multiple corroborating sources. The prosecutor is confident on conviction. Kessler stood, indicating the appointment was concluded. You were fortunate. Most victims don't notice the tracker before the incident occurs. By then, it becomes a question of proving the accident wasn't accidental. Harder to prove without the advanced documentation. Your attention to detail likely saved your life. Margaret stood as well. She gathered the documents she had brought, her chronology, her analysis, the GPS tracker still in its evidence bag. The weight of the tracker in her hand was unchanged, 85 grams, precise, immutable. Physical evidence, a fact that could be measured and recorded. One more thing, Kessler said as Margaret reached the door. She pulled a final document from the folder. It was a bank statement, a copy of an account maintained by Hoffman. Nexus Distribution's parent company is being scrutinized by federal investigators. The company's owner, a man named Richard Brenner, no relation to the fake Herald, has disappeared. His last known location was a shipping port in Baltimore 3 days ago. The investigation is expanding beyond insurance fraud into human trafficking and organized labor exploitation. But that's beyond my jurisdiction. Margaret accepted the document. The bank statement showed transactions totaling approximately $847,000 over an 8-month period. Transfers to various accounts, many with no identifying information beyond account numbers. The records provided a financial skeleton of the operation. No flesh, no context, only the numerical evidence of systematic theft. She left the precinct at 11:23 a.m. The morning had been clear, but clouds had accumulated in the intervening hour, and the light outside had taken on the flat, shadowless quality of an overcast afternoon. The parking lot was nearly empty, the asphalt still damp from overnight rain. She located her vehicle, the Honda CR-V, unmarked by anything except the slight depression in the wheel well where the tracker had been adhered. She drove through the city streets at precisely the speed limit, observing traffic patterns, noting the locations of traffic cameras at major intersections. She observed herself observing these things. The awareness that she had been tracked, that her movements had been documented and analyzed for a purpose beyond her knowledge, had altered something in her perception. She was now aware of the mechanics of surveillance in a way she had not been before, aware of the points of vulnerability in daily routine, the patterns that could be mapped, predicted, exploited. It would take weeks for the insurance policy to be canceled. The bank would eventually return the duplicate charges. Her credit file would require monitoring and restoration. But these were administrative tasks, resolvable through documented procedures. What remained unresolved was the question of how many other targets existed. How many people were currently being tracked by devices they hadn't discovered, following timelines they were unaware of, moving through routines that had been documented and analyzed by people who intended them harm. Kessler had mentioned 6 other targets in active planning stages. 2 of those individuals were unaware. The detective had provided no names, no way to contact them. The investigation would proceed through official channels, through warrant applications and interrogations, through the slow machinery of law enforcement. Margaret drove home in silence, the car moving through the city with the same precision it always had, following roads that had been traveled countless times before, arriving at a destination that was known, mapped, and documented in the city's network of streets. Margaret received a phone call at 8:19 p.m. on a Thursday, 6 days after her meeting with Detective Kessler. The caller ID displayed unknown number. She answered, "Ms. Margaret Ashford?" The voice was male, middle-aged, with a neutral accent that suggested deliberate vocal control. "I'm not Ashford. My name is Margaret Whitmore." There was a pause of approximately 2.3 seconds. "I apologize. I have incorrect information. I'm calling from the State Insurance Fraud Investigation Unit. We're following up on a policy initiated in your name. There seems to be a discrepancy in our records." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "I'm aware of that policy. It's under investigation by the police department." "Yes, we're aware as well. However, we've discovered something in our audit that the police may not yet have identified. I'm calling to inform you that the insurance policy wasn't the only fraudulent document filed in your name during this period. There's a second policy, a different company, different type of coverage." "What type of coverage?" "Homeowners insurance. Filed 11 days ago. The policy lists your address. The beneficiary is listed as an LLC called Merchantside Properties. The claim trigger is fire damage to the structure. The policy amount is $425,000. Margaret did not respond immediately. The mathematics extended again, parallel operations, multiple vectors of attack. The insurance policy that targeted her life was only one component of a larger operation. "I'll email you the policy details," the caller continued. "You should contact your police detective. There's one more thing. We've been auditing all policies filed through our system in the past 6 months with beneficiaries that are LLCs rather than individuals. We found 17 policies matching the pattern you're describing. 17 victims, all filed within a 2-week window, all with different beneficiary entities, all with claim triggers scheduled within the next 30 days. The call ended. Margaret sat in her living room, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the absence of sound. The homeowner's policy arrived in her email inbox at 8:34 p.m., a PDF attachment with a file size of 2.1 megabytes. She printed it immediately. The document was 18 pages, the font consistent with the previous insurance policy, 11-point times New Roman for body text. The policy number was PHX 2849 B19, ML, sequential to her life insurance policy number. The premium had been prepaid, $6,200. She examined the policy details with the same methodical approach she had applied to the first document. The homeowner's address was correct. The policy inception date was 11 days prior. The claim trigger, fire loss to primary structure resulting in total loss, was scheduled to activate 27 days in the future. The documentation required for claim submission included photographs of the property before and after loss, estimates of replacement cost, and proof of loss filed by an adjuster approved by the insurance company. Margaret opened her laptop and searched the beneficiary entity, Merchantside Properties, LLC. The Delaware Business Registry showed the company had been established 9 months prior, with a registered agent listed as Harold Brennan, the same deceased individual whose name had been used for the Ashford Capital Management lease. The company's principal address was a commercial mailbox facility in Wilmington, Delaware. She then contacted her homeowner's insurer directly, calling the number listed on her existing policy. She spoke with a representative named David Chun at 9:17 p.m. Chun confirmed that the second policy existed in their system, but appeared flagged as pending verification due to a discrepancy in the underwriting process. The policy hadn't been activated. However, the premium payment had been processed through a wire transfer from an account Margaret did not recognize. "Can you trace the wire?" Margaret asked. "That would require a law enforcement request, but I can tell you the originating bank. It's a regional bank in Delaware. The account number was partially masked in our system, but the last 4 digits were 7429. Margaret ended the call and immediately contacted Kessler. The detective's voicemail indicated she was off duty until Friday. Margaret left a detailed message, providing the policy number, the beneficiary entity, and the wire transfer information. She then accessed her own bank accounts through her online portal and reviewed the past 2 weeks of activity. No unexplained transactions appeared. No wire transfers. No debits to unfamiliar entities. She pulled up her property tax records and homeowner's insurance documents. Her existing homeowner's policy had been in force for 14 months, with a $385,000 coverage limit. The property had been valued at $420,000 at the time of purchase. She reviewed the purchase documents from her file, a deed, a mortgage agreement, a title insurance policy. The title insurance agent listed on the documents was a company called Landmark Title Services, located in Wilmington, Delaware. Margaret called Landmark Title Services at 10:31 p.m. A recorded message informed her the office was closed and would reopen at 9 a.m. She accessed the company's website instead. The staff directory listed 3 employees, a senior agent, 2 junior agents. One of the junior agents was named Patricia Hoffman. The connection formed without requiring deduction. Hoffman had been present at Margaret's property transaction 14 months prior, well before the tracking device, well before the insurance policies, well before any of the current operation had begun. Margaret examined the transaction documents more closely. The title insurance policy, a document typically 4 to 6 pages, was printed on standard 20-pound paper. She reviewed the signatures on the deed transfer. Her signature appeared twice, once as grantor, once as grantee in the mortgage agreement. She then retrieved the original deed from her filing cabinet. The document was notarized, with the notary's stamp dated to the closing date, 14 months prior. She examined the notary's signature block. The notary's name was James Rothstein. She searched for him in the Delaware Notary Registry. No record. She searched for the notary stamp ID number printed on the document, 47,832 deciliters. No matching record existed in the Delaware Notarial Archives. Margaret opened her laptop again and searched property records for her address. The current owner was listed as Margaret Whitmore. The previous owner was listed as David Keller, with a transaction date of 14 months prior. She searched for David Keller in public records. Multiple individuals by that name existed in Delaware. She narrowed the search to individuals with property transactions in the same county. For matches remained. She pulled property deeds for each. The David Keller who sold the property to her was 73 years old, retired, residing in Florida. She called his phone number at 10:58 p.m. His voicemail indicated he was temporarily unavailable. She left a message explaining that she had purchased his property 14 months prior and needed to verify information from the closing documents. He called back at 6:47 a.m. the following morning. When Margaret asked about the title insurance agent, Keller's response was measured. "I didn't use a title insurance company for that closing," he said. "I used the bank's recommended title agent, a local woman who came to the closing. I don't remember her name, but she was professional, handled everything." "Do you remember the name of the bank?" "Commerce Bank. They're still in business, I think. You should verify all the closing documents. It's been over a year. You'd think you would have already done that." Margaret ended the call and accessed Commerce Bank's records through an online search. The bank had been acquired by a larger regional bank 8 months prior. The records were available through the parent bank's customer service department. She called at 9:04 a.m. and explained that she needed to verify closing documents from a mortgage processed 14 months prior. The representative, a woman named Susan Godfrey, placed the call on hold for approximately 7 minutes. When she returned, her tone had shifted from routine to cautious. "I'm showing that Commerce Bank did process a mortgage for your address," Godfrey said. "But the documents in our system show a different mortgager than the one who currently owns the property. The original mortgage was in the name of David Keller, transferred to his daughter, Jennifer Keller, 11 months after closing. That transfer was never recorded with the county. So legally, the property records show you as owner, but the mortgage records show Jennifer Keller. That's a significant discrepancy." Margaret's pulse registered 88 beats per minute. She observed this fact the way she observed all facts now, as data to be documented. "I need to verify the mortgage documents. Can you send copies?" "Those would have to be requested through the acquired bank's legal department. But I can tell you this. That file is flagged for review. Our compliance team has been looking into it. The closing documents for that transaction show signatures from a notary who isn't registered in Delaware. The bank's compliance officer noticed the irregularity 3 months ago and referred the matter to the state attorney general's office." The call with Godfrey ended at 9:31 a.m. Margaret immediately contacted Kessler again, leaving a second voicemail with the new information: the fraudulent notary, the mortgage discrepancy, the unrecorded transfer to Jennifer Keller. She then searched for Jennifer Keller in public records. Jennifer Keller, age 31, lived in Newark, Delaware. She worked as a paralegal for a law firm called Brandywine and Associates, specializing in title work and real estate transactions. Margaret searched for Brandywine and Associates. The firm's principal partner was listed as Richard Brenner, the same individual who had disappeared according to Kessler, the owner of Nexus Distribution, the man whose last known location was a shipping port in Baltimore. The operation extended backward in time. 14 months of history, tracing back before the tracking device, before Patricia Hoffman's employment at Nexus Distribution, before any of the current surveillance operation. The property transfer was foundational. It established a legal claim to Margaret's home, transferred the title into a chain of custody controlled by the conspiracy. The mortgage discrepancy meant that Margaret did not legally own the property, despite holding the deed and living in the structure. The unrecorded transfer to Jennifer Keller meant the property could be transferred again without Margaret's knowledge, without her signature. She contacted her county's property recorder's office at 9:58 a.m. The office was open, and a clerk named Marcus Holloway was able to review the deed transfer within minutes. The original deed of transfer from David Keller to Margaret Whitmore was recorded properly, with appropriate signatures and notarization. But a second deed of transfer from Margaret Whitmore to Merchantside Properties LLC had been filed 7 days prior. Margaret had not signed this document. The signature block showed her name, but the handwriting was not hers. She had been at her office at the time the deed was filed. The filing time was 10:43 a.m. She had access to the building's security logs. She requested the security footage from her office building for the date of the filing. The building's security office provided the footage at 2:34 p.m. Margaret reviewed it in the building's administrative office on a standard office monitor. The parking lot footage showed no vehicle matching her description during the time window of 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. The building's interior cameras showed her entering at 8:31 a.m. and remaining in the building throughout the morning. No one else had entered the building using her badge credentials. However, a review of the elevator camera footage revealed an individual who resembled Jennifer Keller. Same build, same approximate age, entering the building at 10:07 a.m. using a visitor's badge issued at the main desk. The visitor had proceeded to the third floor, where Suite 340 was located. The visit lasted 18 minutes. The visitor exited at 10:25 a.m. Margaret requested a copy of the visitor log from the main desk. The security guard on duty that morning, a man named Torres, had issued a temporary badge to a woman identified as Jennifer Keller, Legal Services. The badge had been issued at 10:06 a.m. and checked back in at 10:26 a.m. The form requesting the badge had been filled out in Torres' handwriting, with the signature line left blank. Margaret approached Torres at the security desk at 3:11 p.m. He recognized her as an employee but had no recollection of issuing the badge that morning. He reviewed the visitor log entry. The handwriting did not match his own. The letters were formed differently, with a slight rightward slant that his natural writing didn't exhibit. The badge itself bore a recent date, but the laminate showed signs of uneven aging. The edges were more translucent than newer badges, suggesting it had been printed several days prior and antedated to match the current morning's entry. Margaret examined the badge under the desk lamp. The ID photograph showed a woman who resembled Jennifer Keller, but the photo resolution was degraded, suggesting it had been scanned from another document or reproduced multiple times. The security hologram, a security feature designed to prevent forgery, was present but slightly misaligned compared to standard badges, offset by approximately 2 millimeters. She provided all of this information to Kessler in a phone call at 3:47 p.m. The detective listened without interruption, then provided information of her own. "We executed another search warrant this morning," Kessler said. "Richard Brenner's home. We found computers, file cabinets filled with documents, and evidence of a much larger operation than we initially understood. The property fraud isn't incidental to the insurance scheme. The property fraud is the foundation. They were buying homes, or rather, fraudulently transferring ownership of homes and taking out insurance policies against them. When the insurance policy matured, they would file a claim for total loss, collect the proceeds, and disappear. The insurance companies would discover the fraud only after the claim was paid." "How many properties?" Margaret asked. "We're still counting, but preliminary review suggests at least 43 properties. Some purchased legitimately, then fraudulently transferred. Others never actually belonged to the victims. Title was forged from the start. We're contacting all of them now. You're lucky. The property transfer for your home was incomplete. Jennifer Keller filed the deed, but the county recorder's office caught the discrepancy because your mortgage was still in the system under a different name. The system flagged it as a potential fraud indicator before the transfer was finalized in the property records. Margaret absorbed this information. So the transfer isn't valid? Not yet, but it exists in the filing system. The county will be issuing a correction, but that could take weeks. During that time, anyone searching the property records would see two different owners listed, you and Merchantside Properties. It creates confusion, legal ambiguity. That's probably deliberate. The more complicated the paper trail, the longer it takes for victims to untangle it, the longer it takes for insurance companies to deny claims. The conversation ended at 4:12 p.m. Margaret sat in her office, Suite 204, second floor, and observed the physical space around her. The desk, the filing cabinets, the fluorescent lights casting shadowless illumination across the room. The space had not changed. The room was the same as it had been when she arrived that morning. But the documentation of what had occurred in this building, the forged visitor badge, the fraudulent deed filed in Suite 340 by Ashford Capital Management, was permanent. The records had been created and could not be unmade. They could only be corrected through additional documentation, additional time, additional investigation. She left the office at 5:03 p.m. and drove home. The Honda CR-V followed the same route it always did. The traffic patterns were consistent. The traffic lights changed on their programmed schedule. The city moved through the late afternoon with the same mechanical precision it always maintained. When she arrived at her house at 5:47 p.m., she stood in the driveway and observed the structure. The property was a single-family residence, constructed in 1987, with an estimated replacement cost of approximately $385,000 based on current comparable sales. The structure was subject to a homeowner's insurance policy that she held. The structure was also now subject to a fraudulent deed that transferred ownership to an LLC that no longer existed legally. The company was currently subject to dissolution proceedings as part of the investigation into Brenner's assets. She held the deed to the property. She held the mortgage paperwork. She held the title insurance policy from the fraudulent closing. All of these documents were correct, or nearly correct. The foundation of her ownership was corrupt, but the current documentation suggested legitimacy. She entered the house and pulled every document related to the property from her files. The purchase documents, the mortgage statements, the property tax records, the homeowner's insurance policies. She laid them all across her dining room table and began reading through them systematically, line by line, searching for any additional discrepancies, any other evidence of fraudulent alteration. Outside, the evening light was fading to the neutral blue-gray that preceded darkness. The temperature had dropped 3.2 degrees Celsius since she arrived home. The humidity was rising. The barometric pressure indicated an incoming weather system. These were facts that could be observed and measured, documented and recorded. What could not be measured, at least not yet, was the full extent of the conspiracy that had targeted her. The temporal scope was now known to extend back 14 months. The geographic scope included at least Delaware and Maryland. The number of perpetrators remained unknown. The true endpoint of the operation was still unclear. She continued reading through the documents as the evening progressed, observing and recording each piece of information, building an archive of facts against the corruption that had infected the legal and financial systems that were supposed to protect her ownership of her home. Margaret was reviewing the mortgage documents for the third time when she noticed the discrepancy. It was 11:43 p.m., and the dining room was illuminated only by the desk lamp positioned at the table's edge. The document in question was the original mortgage agreement from 14 months prior, the one that listed David Keller as the mortgager and Commerce Bank as the lender. The mortgage amount was $336,000. The property purchase price, according to the deed of transfer, was $420,000. The down payment should have been $84,000. She calculated the percentage, 20%, a standard down payment. The mathematics was correct in isolation, but she then reviewed her own closing statement from the transaction. The purchase price listed on her documents was $420,000. However, the property appraisal, conducted by an independent appraiser 2 weeks before closing, valued the property at $385,000. There was a $35,000 discrepancy between the appraisal and the purchase price. Margaret pulled the appraisal document from the file. It was dated 14 months prior, conducted by an appraiser named William Ashford. The name triggered recognition. Ashford was the same surname used for the fraudulent shell company that had leased Suite 340. She searched the Delaware Appraiser Registry. William Ashford held an active license, but had no business address listed. His registered contact was a P.O. box in Wilmington. She then examined the appraisal document itself more closely. The report was 12 pages, printed on standard appraisal company letterhead. But the letterhead was generic. It could have been printed on any office color printer. The appraiser's signature appeared on page 1 and page 12. The signatures were identical in every measurable way: the pen pressure, the baseline angle, the letter formation. Signatures that appear identical across multiple pages are typically forged. Natural signatures vary slightly due to changes in hand position and writing surface. Margaret then reviewed the mortgage statement she had been receiving monthly for 14 months. The statements were generated by the parent bank, the one that had acquired Commerce Bank. Each statement showed the loan balance, the monthly payment amount, and the interest charged. She pulled statements for month 1, month 6, and month 14. The interest calculation on month 1 was $2,016. The interest calculation on month 6 was $1,968. The interest calculation on month 14 was $1,872. The progression was correct. As principal decreased, interest decreased proportionally. But the original loan amount should have been $336,000, which was the figure on the original mortgage note. At a 4.2% interest rate, the first month's interest should have been $1,176. Instead, the first month showed $2,016. The calculation suggested an original loan amount of approximately $575,000. Margaret searched her files for any document that would explain this discrepancy. She found a second mortgage agreement, folded into the back of the original mortgage documents. This document was dated the same day as the original closing and was barely visible due to its placement. It was a second mortgage in the amount of $240,000, also held by Commerce Bank, with an interest rate of 6.1%. This second mortgage was not listed on her current monthly statements. The statements showed only one mortgage, one interest payment, one principal balance. The second mortgage had been paid off. The payoff date was 2 months prior, according to a discharge document filed with the county. The discharge had been filed by Jennifer Keller, described as the authorized representative of David Keller. The document was notarized by a notary whose stamp ID matched the one used on the fraudulent deed of transfer to Merchantside Properties. Margaret then examined the bank statements she maintained from the past 14 months. She searched for any large payment that might correspond to paying off the second mortgage. The balance required to pay off the second mortgage 2 months prior would have been approximately $238,000, based on the amortization schedule. She found no such payment in her records. Instead, she found a wire transfer that had occurred 2 months prior, initiated from her checking account by someone other than herself. The transfer was in the amount of $238,400, sent to an account at a regional bank in Delaware. The account name was listed as Keller Family Holdings. Margaret had not authorized this wire transfer. She reviewed her bank's fraud protection records. The wire had been approved through her online banking portal using her credentials and her security question response. The security question was, "What is the name of your childhood pet?" The answer she had provided was Rover. The wire transfer had been approved with the correct answer. She then reviewed her online banking history. The account settings had been modified 3 months prior to change the registered email address. The new email address was similar to her own, a variation that substituted the number 1 for the letter I in her first name. Any password reset requests sent to the old email address would have gone unnoticed because she no longer received notifications at that address. The new email address was registered to a Gmail account. She searched for any account recovery options through Gmail. The account creation date was 3 months prior. The phone number associated with the account was a Delaware area code. She searched the phone number in public records. The number was registered to Jennifer Keller. The logical chain extended backward through time with the precision of a mathematical equation. The second mortgage had been fraudulently obtained in her name using forged documents and a falsified appraisal. The appraisal was conducted by William Ashford, the same surname associated with the shell company. The second mortgage had been placed with the knowledge that it would be paid off through an unauthorized wire transfer from her bank account, which had been accessed through her compromised email and security credentials. The payoff discharge was filed using the fraudulent notary's stamp. The property deed transfer was then initiated with the deed filed by Jennifer Keller using a forged visitor badge. But the operation extended further. The first mortgage, the legitimate $336,000 mortgage, was never transferred to her name in the original closing documents. It remained in David Keller's name, with Jennifer Keller listed as the authorized representative. This meant that Margaret was responsible for paying the mortgage, but the property title was in question. If the deed transfer to Merchantside Properties had been completed, the property would have been transferred to an entity that technically had no claim to it. Jennifer Keller had no authority to transfer property that she did not own, unless Jennifer Keller did own it. Unless the original closing 14 months prior was designed to establish Jennifer Keller as the legitimate owner through her role as authorized representative of David Keller. Unless David Keller was complicit in the scheme or was simply a nominal owner whose identity was borrowed for the transaction. Margaret called David Keller again at 12:14 a.m. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice thick with sleep. "I apologize for the hour," Margaret said. "I have a question about your mortgage. Did you ever make any mortgage payments on the property you sold me?" Keller was silent for approximately 3 seconds. "No." Jennifer said she would handle that. She said I didn't need to worry about it. "What? Did you know the property was appraised at $385,000, but sold for $420,000? Another pause. "No, I didn't see those documents." Jennifer handled the closing. "I just signed where she told me to sign." "Did you know there was a second mortgage taken out on the property?" "There was a second mortgage?" Margaret ended the call. The evidence now suggested that David Keller was not complicit in the fraud. He was a victim as well. His identity had been used to establish a mortgage chain that allowed Jennifer Keller to extract $238,000 from Margaret's account through fraudulent wire transfer authorization. But this raised a more fundamental question. What was the purpose of the operation? The second mortgage had been paid off. The property deed was in the process of being transferred to Merchantside Properties. But the insurance policies, the life insurance policy and the homeowner's insurance policy, suggested a different endgame. The insurance policies projected claims that would be filed 27 days in the future for Margaret's death and total property loss. Unless the insurance policies were not the actual target. Unless they were misdirection, a contingency plan if the primary operation encountered obstacles. Margaret pulled the bank statement for Keller Family Holdings, the account that had received the $238,400 wire transfer. She searched Delaware business records for Keller Family Holdings. The company existed, registered 18 months prior, with Jennifer Keller listed as principal officer. The company's registered agent was listed as Patricia Hoffman. She then reviewed the timeline of the entire operation. 18 months prior, Keller Family Holdings established. 14 months prior, property closing, second mortgage fraudulently obtained, second mortgage amount transferred to Keller Family Holdings account via unauthorized wire transfer. 9 months prior, Ashford Capital Management established. 8 months prior, Ashford Capital Management leases Suite 340. 6 months prior, property transfer deed forged and filed, but rejected due to mortgage discrepancy. 3 months prior, Margaret's email account compromised, online banking access modified, second mortgage paid off through fraudulent discharge. 3 weeks prior, GPS tracker installed, silver sedan surveillance begins. 2 weeks prior, life insurance policy initiated, homeowner's insurance policy initiated, fraudulent visitor badge created, second deed of transfer filed with Margaret's forged signature. Margaret calculated the total amount extracted from her account, $238,400 from the wire transfer, plus approximately $6,200 in fraudulent insurance premiums, plus approximately $1,300 in duplicate credit card charges. The total was approximately $246,000. But this was only her case. Kessler had mentioned 17 other victims with similar insurance policies. If each victim had a second mortgage fraudulently placed and paid off through unauthorized wire transfer, the total extracted would be approximately $4.5 million. And this was only the insurance policy portion of the operation. Kessler had mentioned 43 properties involved in the scheme. If 43 properties each had fraudulent mortgages placed, the total extracted through those operations alone would be substantially higher. The motive became clear: systematic asset liquidation. Jennifer Keller and Richard Brenner and the network of accomplices had constructed a machine to extract equity from property owners through a combination of fraudulent mortgages, unauthorized wire transfers, identity theft, and false insurance claims. Each victim was targeted because they had property with sufficient equity to support a second mortgage. The second mortgage was immediately paid off through wire transfer, then discharged through fraudulent paperwork. The property was then transferred to a shell entity. Insurance policies were initiated as a contingency. If the property transfer succeeded, the equity was extracted and the victim was left with a property they no longer owned. If the property transfer was discovered, the insurance claim would pay out based on fraudulent total loss. Margaret sat in silence. The bank statements and mortgage documents spread across the dining room table. The light from the desk lamp cast sharp shadows across the papers. It was now 1:04 a.m. She called Detective Kessler, leaving a voicemail with the account number for Keller Family Holdings, the timeline connecting Jennifer Keller to the property fraud, and the evidence of the unauthorized wire transfer from her account. She then drafted a written summary of her analysis, printing it at 1:23 a.m. and placed it in an envelope to deliver to the police station. But before she sealed the envelope, she reviewed one final document, the original visitor log entry from when Jennifer Keller had supposedly entered her office building. She examined Torres's handwriting again. The letters were formed with a slight rightward slant, the way someone writes when they are right-handed but writing on a surface that is angled away from their body. She then examined the discharge document for the second mortgage. The notary's signature appeared in the lower right corner of the page. The handwriting matched the pattern from the visitor log entry. Same rightward slant, same letter formation. The document had not been signed by a notary. It had been signed by Jennifer Keller using forged credentials. Margaret sealed the envelope and sat back in her chair. The investigation had concluded with a quiet accumulation of facts, each piece of evidence leading to the next, the logical chain extending from the fraudulent appraisal to the identity theft to the unauthorized wire transfer to the forged discharge to the property deed transfer. There was no dramatic revelation, no moment of sudden understanding. Only the patient assembly of data, the observation that certain facts did not align with other facts, the slow realization that the entire transaction, from 14 months prior to the present, had been engineered by a network of individuals whose purpose was to extract wealth through systematic fraud. Richard Brenner had provided the infrastructure through Nexus Distribution. Jennifer Keller had provided the technical expertise in real estate and notarial fraud. Patricia Hoffman had provided access to financial institutions and insurance company databases. William Ashford had provided falsified appraisals. The network had operated in parallel, each individual filling a specific role in a scheme designed to remain invisible until the victim attempted to verify their ownership of property that no longer legally belonged to them. Margaret placed the envelope on the table beside the GPS tracker, which remained in its evidence bag. Two physical objects. Two pieces of evidence from the beginning and the end of the investigation. She would deliver the envelope to the police station at 8 a.m. She would allow Detective Kessler to continue the investigation using the information Margaret had compiled. But the resolution was already clear. The case had solved itself through the accumulation of facts, through the patient observation of discrepancies, through the logical connections between seemingly unrelated documents. The second mortgage had been the key. Once that discrepancy was identified, everything else followed. The forged appraisal, the unauthorized wire transfer, the identity theft, the property deed transfer, the insurance policies, all of it was downstream from that single fraudulent mortgage. Margaret stood and turned off the desk lamp. The dining room fell into darkness. Outside, the city continued its mechanical operations, traffic lights changing on schedule, streetlights illuminating empty roads, the infrastructure of daily life continuing without pause, indifferent to the individual acts of fraud that occurred within its boundaries. She would sleep now. In the morning, she would deliver the evidence. The legal system would take possession of the facts and process them through its established procedures. Jennifer Keller would be arrested. The other accomplices would be identified and prosecuted. The property would be legally returned to Margaret's ownership. The fraudulent wire transfer would be reversed. The unauthorized insurance policies would be canceled. But for now, the work was complete. The facts had been assembled. The truth had been identified. The investigation had reached its conclusion not with fanfare or sudden realization, but with the quiet satisfaction of having traced a thread through a maze and found the source from which it originated.